Hey, it's me, your old pal Bigfoot, on vacation here in an unnamed island, chilling for Memorial Day with some suds, some buds, and some fine young human females. Hey, you know that summer's now here, so check out the links to our all-new monster t-shirts available in the details of this video. And now, on to our Memorial Day marathon of spooky stories told in the rain. And while you guys are in the rain, we're all gonna suffer out here in the sun. Have a spooky holiday. Now, what was I saying, ladies? Scary Monster Tales Audio, Volume 1. First of an ongoing series of monster tales told in the rain. I've lowered the super loud noises so that you can use this as a sleep stories collection if you'd like, but I've got some neat dogman and cryptid moving illustrations in case you're not ready to close your eyes just yet. In this first volume, we've got 3 kinds of Pennsylvania cryptids that you might not have ever heard of before. But we're starting it off with a creature that you're probably quite familiar with. I saw a quadrupedal dogman interact with a bipedal one. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I have led a pretty boring life. I never had anything outrageous happen to me. The only celebrity I ever saw was Al Roker. Like I said, it's been a boring life. But I've got one story to tell, because I've had one single interesting thing happen to me. The thing is, that one story I've got to tell is so over the top that now when I finally have a good anecdote to share, hardly anyone even believes what I'm telling them. I'll give you your chance to scoff at me next, because I once had a cryptid sighting. In fact, I had 2 cryptid sightings, and it was just about the strangest day of my life. I was in West Leechburg with a friend of mine who lived over there. It was autumn and there were dead leaves on the ground that crunched when you walked on them. We were strolling down this tree-lined street that I think was Gyron Street or Gyron Street. Then we saw what we thought was a bear approaching. My buddy signaled for me to be quiet, and he started climbing up this really good climbing tree. I joined him, and soon we were watching the action from the bird's eye view. When it came closer to us, that big bear, walking down on all 4s, seemed kind of strange looking to me. My friend leaned over and whispered, "That's a dog. It's a giant dog." I couldn't really argue the point either. It looked like an oversized canine to me too. And that is when the most incredible moment of my life happened. Bursting out of the woods, making a racket, crunching leaves, and almost walking into that big bear-like canine was an upright walking werewolf-type creature. It seemed like a dog, but it seemed like a man too. And when it saw the other dogman over there, down on all 4s, it did a pretty interesting thing, I think. The upright one held his hand out, with his wrist limp, so as not to stress out the other large canine. It was just the way I've seen people approach cats or dogs that they don't know yet, holding out their hand so that the animal can smell them and tell some things about them right off the bat. Anyway, the big dogman down on all 4s really couldn't have cared less that the bipedal dogman was up and walking around. As long as he kept out of the big guy's way, then that seemed to be all that mattered to him. And so, both sides satisfied, they each continued on in the direction they had been going. There was to be no turf war on that day. I guess the upright one offering his paw to smell was an act of submission to the big one, down on all 4s. Although that was the larger animal of the 2 of them, I would have to say was also much, much older than the upright one. It wasn't clear to me which of the 2 of them might have won if the fight had come to blows. But it didn't, and my friend and I got to witness an actual peaceful interaction between two legendary, man-eating, cryptid carnivores. And from now to the day I leave this plane of existence, I can lay claim to the fact that I saw a quadrupedal dogman interact with a bipedal one. The four-footed monkey dog. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got some good news for you. I have seen a new kind of an animal. At least I think it's new to the human race, or at least the race of those of us who live in Pennsylvania. It is possible that this is an out-of-place exotic creature, and so I'm going to describe for you the 2 times I caught brief but convincing glimpses of this thing. Both happened on Furnace Road, which is gorgeous during the day, but can give off a sort of a creepy vibe at night. I usually have to drive that road at night, when I drive it at all, and both of my sightings happened after dark. Since they were both pretty similar experiences, I should probably just combine the details to shorten how long it takes to tell. In both cases, the creature ran out onto the road, alarming me, because its movements to me resembled those of a kind of a giant rat. It didn't walk, it scurried into the middle of the road, saw my car coming, then he scurried back to the side of the road. Once back on the side, though, he stood up taller, and I guess he was about the size of a medium dog. He wasn't a dog, though. He was sort of like this mini gorilla in some ways, but he was 4-legged, and he seemed to have paws, not hands, you know. His back end was lower than his front. His back legs much shorter than his front legs too. But they still look like legs in the front, not arms as they appear to be on a gorilla. And that was another thing. It didn't have ears like a gorilla either. It had ears that to me looked like they belonged on a cat, I guess. Maybe a wolf? But they were triangular cat ears on top of this little monkey-faced dog. And he seems to live up there by Furnace Road, if you ask me. Of course, I haven't seen him in about a month, so he might not be there any longer. I wonder if he was some kind of escaped zoo animal, or if he has a family of other creatures like him living around there. In either case, I hope he finds his way back to wherever he's supposed to be. And if he's really supposed to be in the woods along Furnace Road, in the hills of Pennsylvania, then I sure hope some other people start seeing him. I sure as heck don't want to be the only person in the world who ever saw the four-footed monkey dog of McVaytown, Pennsylvania. The Hell's Hollow Hellcat or Howler. Dear Scary Stories NYC, there's a park in Portersville called Hell's Hollow that's really more like heaven on earth, if you ask me. It's got a nice hiking trail and a gorgeous waterfall. There are 2 different occasions in which I was alone in that natural area, and I witnessed what I'm going to call the Catman. The second time, I think he witnessed me right back. What is the Pennsylvania Catman? I don't know, really, as I haven't found anyone else besides me who's even seen it yet. I also like to call it the Hell's Hollow Hellcat, or maybe the Hell's Hollow Howler. That sounds pretty good. I did sort of hear it howl once, so there's that. The first time I saw him, I was sitting under the falls, but off in the woods a bit. I like to sit where people are unlikely to accidentally trip over me if they're hiking on or near the trail. I try to find spots where people won't even notice me, or even where animals won't notice me for that matter. If you sit still enough in nature, sometimes wild birds will come right up to you unafraid. And while I was enjoying this quiet time, I heard that cat howling or yowling that I mentioned earlier. It sounded like a cat that was extremely upset and angry, and I looked up to see if I could understand what was happening. There, above the falls, there was a big cat tumbling down the tree-covered hill, leading down to the water and the falls. It was trying to arrest its drop but failing, hence the terrible racket it was raising, not to mention a big cloud of dust as it rolled and fell. Eventually it splashed into the water and went over the falls, then waded to the shore on the far side from me, drying itself in the sun and licking its wounds. I held as still as I could, not daring to leave the scene until the cat had finished its grooming. I got a pretty good look at that beast, and it was not your ordinary bobcat. This was a kind of a Catman. It stood on its hind legs, except when a sound in the woods would frighten it. Then it would drop to all fours and prepare to run if it needed to. But the rest of the time it seemed to prefer standing upright, like a human being. It was a very beautiful animal. I'd even call it cute. But that was clearly something that could turn into a man-eater if it needed to. I mean, it was a little bit smaller than I am, but I don't have claws and teeth like that thing. And I got the impression it was probably much stronger than a grown man as well. No, believe me, I kept my head low, and I breathed in a shallow manner until that creature was up and out of there. Now, the second time I saw a cryptid Catman at Hell's Hollow, I was hanging out by that stream over there, which tends to usually be a quieter location to chill and hang. And it was on that day as well, until I heard a splashing sound coming from further down the stream. Once again, I was doing my thing of hanging out in the bushes so that I would be out of the way and not very noticeable to people passing by. When I craned my neck to see who was coming downstream, though, my eyes did not fall on a human being. They fell on that Catman again, and I remember pulling my sneakers up under that bush to make certain that I was hidden. From what I could make out, the Catman was chasing what I at first thought might be a fish. Later, I saw that it was something white and furry, like either a small rabbit or a very large rodent of some other sort. The prey was splashing into and out of the water, while the Catman was attempting to bounce back and forth on little outcroppings of rock or land or tree roots and avoid getting himself all wet. When the two of them got to almost underneath the spot I was hiding in, the small white thing ran up onto the land and in the direction away from me. The Catman hopped in that same direction and appeared poised to resume his chase of the smaller prey into the woods. But then he stopped short, facing away from me, and stood perfectly still on his hind cat feet. Somehow I knew this meant he had sensed my presence, and I scooted back a few inches into a darker spot. Time froze, and I swear I could hear a very, very deep growling coming from down there. I wanted to cry. I wanted to go to the bathroom, but mostly I wanted that Catman to go away. Instead, the Hell's Hole Howler turned around and faced directly toward the bush that I was hiding behind. My body must have thought that was the end of Act 3, because I evacuated, and tears began involuntarily leaking from my eyes and down my cheeks. That Catman knew where I was, and I had a lot more meat on me than that little white furball it was chasing. Would it give up that chase and come for me? I waited to see what would happen, shaking all over, and too frightened to make any move at all. When that beast finally trotted off after the other prey, I laid down on the ground and I passed out. I slept a couple of hours before I could deal with being conscious again. Now, I am not going to suggest that anyone go looking for this thing, because it could really rip you to shreds without even trying. But I sure do wish that I wasn't the only one who had seen the Hell's Hollow Hellcat. The Black Beast of Bucktown PA. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My girlfriend and I recently had a cryptid sighting when we were someplace we weren't supposed to be, doing something we weren't supposed to be doing. We got a picture of the monsters, but we can't post it on our social because then we would have to explain to our parents why we were in the woods behind the Harris Hill Brewing Company in Bucktown. Or actually, my girlfriend is correcting me. It seems the beer cafe is technically in Pottstown, PA, but it is located a few blocks from Bucktown, only a minute's drive away. I'm glad I didn't know when I named the monster, though, since I think Beast of Bucktown sounds badass. And I can't think of any scary names at all for this creature that start with a P. So I guess you can probably already figure out the story before I even tell it. We went to the Brew Cafe, then we walked out back to the parking lot, but instead of getting in the car, we just kept on walking into those woods so that we could have a little private time away from prying eyes. The thing is, just as you would expect in a story with a title like this one has, we both soon had that feeling that we were being watched. And of course, in a story like this, that feeling always turns out to be justified. We kept stopping what we were doing to go look around, which is something we had never done before. Usually, we don't even care that much if people want to gawk. I mean, one day we'll be old, and then nobody will want to look anymore, right? So whatever. But that night, it really bugged me, and I could tell it was bothering my girl even worse. So we decided this was pointless. Then we started walking back to the car, and that's when we saw them. There were two of them, which I guess the title doesn't really let you know about in advance. Feel free to change that, make it plural, because there were two of them, and one of them looked right at the camera when I took the photo I sent you. I mean, I'd already be viral with that image, if it didn't mean I'd get my girlfriend in trouble with her folks, you know. I thought one of the creatures had horns on his head, the one on the right, but it was just the way the wind was blowing his long fur around. As you can see, the creatures had chimpanzee-like faces, but the ears were on top of their heads like dogs or bears. The ears were round, like bear ears, but seemed bare in the other way, the B-A-R-E way, as in not covered in fur. It's an interesting combination of features. And of course the eyes were so bright. They seemed to have made the rest of the photo look darker. I don't actually remember it being that dark there. Anyway, I didn't get a chance to snap a second picture because those two things both made a loud squeal, like pigs or boars. And then they charged toward us. One of them leaped on my back and started pulling my hair out of the back of my head. I ran backward into the car, and he fell off my back. My girl drove me to see the doctor, but I only had surface wounds. Those creatures were nasty, and I'm just glad that my girlfriend runs so much faster than me. She was able to get in the car and get it started, while I was doing the monkey dog monster ballet. These creatures are not man-sized, but they are very strong, and their claws are sharp. I got my wounds cleaned pretty quickly, and there was no infection, so the animal doesn't use poison or anything of that nature. I don't think they had thumbs, although they tended to attack me from behind, so I couldn't always tell what was happening. Those claws felt like they must have been as long as badger claws, just deadly long. I wonder if the two I saw were mates, and I wonder where they came from. That's not exactly a nature preserve, it's just a small grove of woods. The Coventry Woods Preserve is a few miles to the north, though. It's a 4-minute drive max, and it's a drive through the country to get there. So my guess is that these two painful lovebirds came from up there somewhere. That was why me and my friend I'll call Harry wanted to drive up Chestnut Hill Road toward that woods preserve, and we wanted to do it at night. With the eye shine those little monsters give off, I figured we'd be able to see them in the dark, as long as I kept my headlights on to give them some light to reflect back at us from the shadows. As soon as we got near the place, both my girl and Harry's started to freak out, and they said they wanted to bail on this mission. We calmed them down and told them it's just going to take 3 minutes, and I really wanted to get a second photo of those creatures. We were driving really slowly, looking back and forth in the night, when all of a sudden, this round object about as big as a human head comes careening out from between two trees, and both the girls scream. That made me and Harry scream too. And soon, all four of us were screaming when a kid came out from between some trees and picked up his soccer ball, which is what it was. He looked at the four of us like we had lost our minds. We had gotten ourselves that worked up, and we were still driving through the residential area outside of the natural one. There was no way the ladies were going to allow us to do anything but turn around and go home. And to be honest, I'm kind of glad of it. I mean, if a soccer ball can get us that scared, imagine if we really had run into those two badger-clawed, monkey-faced dogmen again. This episode brought to you by our new line of Scary Stories t-shirts. Catman, the Beast of Bucktown, Monkey Dog, and Dogman. Use discount code YTShopping25 for a full 25% off. And now this. Dogman and the Manson Women. Dear Scary Stories NYC, there's this former office building off the highway at the edge of my town, and I used to go over there when I was a teenager to set off firecrackers. There was plenty of space in the back that used to be a parking lot, and I could fire off rockets without them landing in the woods and starting a fire. Also, no adults knew about that place, so I felt safe. I was the kind of teenager that liked to be alone, and that place was lonely. Usually. On this particular day, as I was about to walk out of the woods behind the old abandoned building on my side, some figures walked out from the opposite side. My first impression was that they looked like older kids, so I jumped behind a tree and peeked out. What I saw blew my mind. It was these two Manson girls, you know? These two young women, sorta scantily clad and low-class looking, but their bikini tops and designer jeans looked expensive. Good rich girls gone bad. That was my first impression at a distance. The guy they were walking with hung back at first. He seemed to be playing with his little black and white yappy dog. I could see that they were talking, but with the distance between us and the nearness of the highway, the only one I could really hear clearly was that loudmouth little dog. So now some of you might remember that I promised my mind was blown by what I saw, and unless those poor little rich girls were the most beautiful of all time, and they weren't, then I have yet to describe something mind-blowing. So let's get started with that then, shall we? When the male companion of the two young ladies walked out into the afternoon sun, I saw the first cryptid of my life. At least, he looked like a cryptid. I nearly fainted because he was this brown dog man. He had a dog head, and he was walking like a human. The thing is, I think he was really a werewolf, and not a dog man, because he seemed too intelligent to be just an animal. And also, he was wearing gloves. So was the taller of the two girls, in fact. They were black gloves, maybe rubber or something like that. They were shiny, and extended a few inches past the wrist in a slightly flared-out style, like a superhero glove, sort of. His matched hers. The shorter girl did not have these gloves on. All of them seemed jolly and merry, as though they were having a super fun day. And in that instant, I thought those were the coolest-looking girls in the world. I was a teenager, though. I was naive and quite innocent about women, for another 5 or 6 months at least. So yes, I did sort of wonder if it could have been a cosplayer in that Wolfman costume. But it was a really hot day. I was in shorts. The girls were in bikini tops. That guy would faint if he were wearing a monkey suit. He had to actually be a creature that looked like a dogman. But how would you go about getting rubber gloves on a dogman? He had to have put them on himself, which to me makes him more likely a werewolf than a dogman. He also seemed to be speaking to the girls, although I was too far away to hear any words. For all I know, he might have been barking at them, So I watched in secret as the group made their way over to a mound of dirt on the side of the office building that I hadn't noticed before. Something about that mound of dirt made the girls laugh out loud and point at it. I couldn't even imagine what they were seeing from my point of view, so I just kept looking. All three of them seemed to thoroughly enjoy whatever was over there, and they laughed uproariously. Eventually, they grew tired of whatever they were doing, and the three of them with their little dog walked back the way they came. I waited for some time, then I snuck over to that mound of dirt to view it from the angle that they had. It was a mound of dirt. A freshly dug mound of dirt. What was so funny about that? I was about to leave when I thought I saw the dirt move. I stayed there, watching, trying to see it move again. I saw nothing, and nothing, and my mind drifted to the idea that setting off firecrackers might be more interesting than staring at dirt. But then, that pile of dirt definitely moved. There was something alive in that dirt. Without thinking, I dug into the mound, and I found a woman tied up and gagged, covered in dirt, and left for dead. I untied her, and I ripped her gag out so she could breathe, but she did not thank me. Instead, she rose up and threw me to the ground, and I fell back hard, almost losing consciousness from the force of it. It was my adrenaline that kept my eyes opened, as I saw this woman I had freed, clearly, for the first time. She seemed to be some kind of half-human, half-animal thing. She was probably a werewolf too. I had wandered into some kind of intra-tribal werewolf warfare. I thought that beast woman was going to bite my face off, but instead she ran off into the woods the way I had come. I tell you, I didn't mind walking along the highway to get back home. It took an extra 40 minutes, but I didn't have to cut through any dark woods that I had just seen some kind of dog woman run into. I wonder if those two bikini-topped women were werewolves also, or if they were just that wolfman's groupies. I have wondered about all of them since this happened, but I studiously avoided that area, never returning after that day. And so, at least so far, that was the last time that I ever saw Dogman and the Manson women. Story 2. Dogman on motorcycle means doom. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a weird relationship with Kelly Road in Industry, Pennsylvania. They say it's a haunted road, so it is supposed to be weird there. But some of my friends and I keep seeing something that we can't find in any of the folklore about that spooky road. We see a dogman over there, and each time we do, something terrible happens to our car before 24 hours are up. I know it sounds like a superstition, so I'll just tell you literally what happened, and then you can tell me what this is all about. I admit we may have brought this on ourselves, because we went there legend tripping back before the pandemic, looking to see something spooky. I think that was when whatever it is that's over there noticed us, and I think it decided to show us something spooky for the rest of our lives. First of all, if you don't already know, Kelly Road, which runs between Engle Road and Wolf Run Road, is known to get foggy at night and in the morning, which just adds to the creepy vibe of the place. And that is what the legend of Kelly Road is about. A bad vibe. People are known to lose their temper and fly off the handle over there. And not just humans either. Animals flip out and attack for no reason. One of my friends told me that his cousin got attacked by a deer on Kelly Road, which is a weird thing for me to even picture in my head. So it is a really strange place. When I saw the dogman there for the first time, I kind of felt like he was the spirit of that place, maybe. Or maybe he's the reason for the bad vibe. Because we're talking about one badass, scary dogman. The first time we saw him was the first time we went to Kelly Road. and it was a pretty grand entrance. We were going through one of the two forested areas, and around a curve, driving way too fast, was a motorcycle with the largest driver you can imagine. It was almost like a bear riding a motorcycle, but it was this werewolf, a werewolf with leather boots on, if you can imagine. He started driving right at us, and my friend Oscar, who was at the wheel, turned and drove straight into a tree. His dad's car was wrecked, and so was our night, but at least that dogman didn't turn his bike around and come back to finish us off. My mother made me chip in to Oscar's car repair fund, but my other two friends got away scot-free. That was the last time Oscar went joyriding in his life, man. It took him so long to pay his dad back for those repairs. We were just lucky we weren't hurt. That was the way I looked at it, and I was ready to put the entire bizarre episode behind me. But I kept dreaming about that dogman or werewolf. It's kind of a hard image to get out of your head once you've seen it with your own eyes. It was a dogman, but it was riding a motorbike. I mean, what planet do we live on? So as fate would have it, I got a job running errands for this company, and when I needed to get paid, I would have to visit the boss who I swear you was living back then on Kelly Road. Every time I went there, I felt scared. I've never once felt angry on Kelly, which is I know how you're supposed to feel. But I really dread driving down that road. I feel like I'm being watched every time I do it. So after I think it was 2 or 3 months of me going to Kelly Road to get paid, I started to feel more comfortable about it. One night I was driving over to get my money, and had one of my buddies with me who had been there when the motorcycle riding dogman came around that curve trying to run us off the road. He was remembering that night out loud as I drove, and I was getting creeped out because it was a dark evening as this was happening. When we got to the curve, the beast man had come around too fast that night. I couldn't help myself. I just slowed down a bit, and I pulled over to the right just a bit as well. And then whiz, around that curve came the huge, wide dogman, driving his motorbike way too fast and cutting it way too close on my side. I finished pulling the car off the road and let him pass, since I had slowed down beforehand. Did my buddy and I cause that to happen by talking about it? I mean, that was not something ordinary that happened. The timing of it was like something from a movie. It couldn't have been an accident. Let's just say that much at least. I figured I was lucky, but the next morning, my car wouldn't start, and it never started again. I had to sell it for parts, but there was an upside to losing that car. It meant I had to quit that job that caused me to have to drive on Kelly Road. One of my other friends I'll call Serge, who was there at that first sighting and crash, told me that he also saw the dogman riding the motorcycle one more time, but it was at a different part of the road, and it just drove past. It didn't try to run him off the road. However, a few blocks later, some other guy ran a red light and slammed hard into Serge's fender, knocking his bumper right off the car and destroying one of his headlights. At least the car kept running and didn't need to be trashed. I'd say maybe the dogman is losing his touch, but I'm pretty sure that would get me 40 years bad luck if I said that. I know that I plan on never visiting Kelly Road again for the rest of my life, but somehow I sense that even if I packed my bags and moved to California, fate would still somehow, some way, send me back to Pennsylvania, and I'd find myself driving down Kelly Road all over again. And when I do, I'd better be able to afford myself a new car, because that dogman will be waiting for me around that curve just up ahead. Chased by dogman through Michigan. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When my son and I set out to hike Canyon Falls Trail in Michigan, we were looking forward to waterfalls and scenic beauty. We were entirely unprepared to be chased through the woods like we were meat by the dogman. As my son and I set out on our hike in northern Michigan, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. The sun was shining down on us warmly, and I could feel the relaxation of the forest envelop me. The trail was surrounded by lush foliage, with towering trees extending up to the sky. The scent of pine and cedar filled the air, and I took in a deep breath, relishing the refreshing aroma. As we walked, we were greeted by various creatures. A family of deer grazed in the distance, and we could hear the chirping of birds above our heads. Once we came across a little snake resting on a branch, and my son was fascinated. We passed fields of vivid wildflowers, with each step offering new and mesmerizing plants. I pointed out the refreshing scent of spearmint near the water's edge, and informed my son how Native Americans had used it for medicinal purposes. It turned out he knew way more about that than I did, and oh boy did I get a long lecture about the many uses of spearmint. We walked for the entire morning and afternoon, having quite an enjoyable day. But as fun as the day had been, when the sun began to set, I started to feel a sense of unease creeping over me. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was following us. I kept looking around, but I couldn't spot anything out of the ordinary. My son seemed to be lost in his own world, snapping pictures of wildlife with his camera. Suddenly, a dark figure off in the foliage in the distance caught my eye. It was too tall to be a human, or an animal, and it walked like a man in either case. I nudged my son, and asked him if he could see that too. He looked up and he gasped. The dark figure was closing in on us, and so we started to run, not having any idea what we were running from. As we sprinted through the woods, my heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of my own labored breathing. The creature was still chasing us, and I could hear its heavy footsteps echoing through the trees. It was closing in, and I knew we had to do something. We came to a small clearing and decided to make our stand. We turned around, and that's when I saw it. It was a 12-foot tall creature, and muscular, with the body of a man and the head of a dog. I had heard stories about these creatures before, called Dogman. I had always dismissed them as just a legend, but here we were, facing a real Dogman. The creature didn't hesitate. It lunged at us, and we had to dive out of the way to avoid being caught. After missing us, the beast stopped running and began to bellow out loud. It sounded more like he was threatening us than howling for others of his kind, but I wouldn't really know in either case. While he stood there screaming, we kept running, desperate to find a way out of the forest. The creature was soon enough back to chasing us, and I could hear its heavy breaths coming closer. As we continued running through the overgrown forest, the howls or screams of the Dogman echoed through the trees. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw the faint outline of a cabin. "We have to get to that cabin," I shouted to my son. As we neared it, the howls grew louder and more intense. We could hear the Dogman crashing through the brush behind us, gaining on us with every passing moment. My legs ached as I raced through the undergrowth, fear pulsing through my veins. Just as we reached the tiny wooden cottage, barely larger than a shack, I heard the Dogman's terrible snarl close behind us. Turning around, I saw it barrel toward us, its eyes glowing in the dark. We were trapped. With no other options, we scrambled up the front steps of the cabin and shoved the door open, hurrying inside and slamming it shut behind us. The cabin was old and musty, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards, but it was a refuge from the Dogman, at least for now. Panting heavily, we looked around for any signs of danger, but the cabin appeared to be empty. We were alone in the middle of nowhere, with the Dogman just outside our door. As we huddled together, trying to come up with a plan, we heard scratching at the door. The Dogman was trying to get inside. We looked at each other, eyes wide with terror. We had to come up with something, and fast. We began to pray fervently, asking God to protect us and keep us safe. The sound of gunfire outside made us all jump, and through the window we could see the Dogman running off into the darkness. But who had fired the shot? Suddenly the door burst open, and a grizzled old man stood in that doorway, holding a shotgun. "What in tarnation are you doing in my cabin?" he bellowed. "Get out of here, you troublemakers." I tried to explain our situation, but he wouldn't listen. He continued to yell at us, telling us to leave his property immediately. We gathered our things quickly and left, knowing that we were walking out into the Dogman's forest. We walked a ways and then came across a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set up camp for the night. We quickly built a fire and settled in, hoping for some sort of reprieve from the chaos of the day. As we sat around the fire, I couldn't help but feel hopeful. Maybe we had finally found a safe haven, a place where we could gather our thoughts and come up with a plan for our next steps. But then we heard it, a low growl in the distance, followed by the sound of something moving through the woods. My heart sank as I realized that Dogman had found us again. We quickly moved to pack up our things, but before we could even start, it burst through the tree line. Its eyes gleamed in the firelight, and I knew we were in trouble. We tried to run, but it was too fast. It chased us through the woods, its barks echoing through the darkness. We ran and ran, our hearts pounding in our chests, but it was relentless. We could hear it getting closer and closer, its breath hot on our heels. Finally, we came across a climbable and very tall tree, and I pushed my son toward it. "Climb up," I yelled, pushing him forward. He scrambled up the trunk as I turned toward the Dogman, hoping to buy enough time for my son to get to safety. I picked up a nearby stick and I held it out in front of me, ready to defend myself. But it was no use. The Dogman was too powerful, too strong. It leapt forward and knocked me to the ground, its jaws gnashing at my face. I closed my eyes, ready for the end, but then I heard a gunshot, followed by the sound of something hitting the ground running. The pressure was off my chest. The Dogman had run off. When I opened my eyes, sure enough, the Dogman was gone. And standing over my body, looking down at me, was the grizzled old man, holding a smoking shotgun. "You folks need to be more careful," he said, as he helped me to my feet. "This place ain't safe." I nodded, still in shock from what had just happened. The old man took us into his place and allowed us to try sleeping sitting up on the floor until the sun came back up. When we went back to our abandoned camp in the morning, we found our tents and backpacks torn, with many of our personal items tossed in the now smoldering campfire. Plastic does not smell good when it burns, and neither does whatever cell phones are made of. So I know that there are some nice Dogmen out there, but this clearly was not one of them. And that was the upsetting end to a nightmarish hiking trip when we went to northern Michigan, and we almost didn't come back. This next part is not just some filler. This is where we all say thanks to Stacy Miller. Please join me in thanking tonight's executive producer, Stacy Miller, who is a member of our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Her club membership means Stacy gets to see our secret uncensored episodes far too wild to run on this channel. And so can you. Chet, the Dogman, Dear Scary Stories, NYC. I have a small collection of Dogman stories that seem to date to about 100 years ago, which were passed down to my uncle Stan, who agreed to write them down for me in an email for you. He heard the stories from his grandfather, who claimed they happened to him personally. Our family at that time, this was around 1920, were all dirt poor, living in a small collection of houses in a bit of woods in the Midwest outside of some small town. In that place there was an upright walking Dogman who had moved from hunting to scavenging, living off the kindness of the local population. Without any further ado, here is my uncle's email, which contains within it a second email from the descendant of a different witness to this particular upright walking canine of the 1920s. Take it away, Uncle Stan. Well, gather round, and I'll tell you young'uns a story by my grandfather Tate and his good friend Chet. Chet was a dogman, you see. He walked upright just like us, but he was much taller and more muscular than any man I've ever met. He had thick, shaggy fur covering most of his body, and a fierce set of teeth that could scare off any living thing that got in his way. Now, my grandfather Tate met Chet when they were both just youngsters. They lived in an area of the woods where 3 family clans made their homes, called the Village at the time by the people from that area. Chet the Dogman haunted the woods around that same small village on the outskirts of town, and Chet often wandered into town to scavenge for food behind restaurants and in garbage cans. Grandfather Tate was a curious boy, and he was fascinated by Chet. Most people found the upright walking bear-sized canine a frightening sight, as you might well imagine. But young Grandpa Tate would leave scraps of food out for Chet to find, encouraging him to hang out near his family's house more. Eventually, the boy and the oversized dog became friends. Chet quickly became an important part of the village, by which I mean just those 3 extended families, who all lived in that woodland there. I presume it was one of them who named Chet in the first place, although the origin of his name has been lost to history. Chet was an incredible hunter on top of his scavenging talents, so once he was accepted by the others, he stopped only taking from them and would sometimes share his kills with them, or even go hunting in conjunction with the humans. Another way that Chet became valuable was that he was always willing to protect the villagers from any danger. He even became something of a bodyguard for my grandfather Tate in his teen years and young adulthood. No one dared mess with Tate if Chet was by his side. One day Chet saved my grandfather Tate's life. Tate was out in the woods when a pack of wolves surrounded him. He was sure he was done for, but then Chet came to his rescue. He fought the wolves off, almost single-handedly, and saved Grandfather Tate's life. Those dogs were ferocious, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. Their fangs were bared as they circled Grandfather Tate, growling and snapping. Tate had no weapon, no way to defend himself against the wild pack. Suddenly one of the dogs yelped and went flying through the air. The pack turned as one to see what had caused the commotion. What they saw froze them instantly. There, silhouetted against the moon, was a huge, upright dogman. His name was Chet. He stood as tall as a grizzly bear, with muscled arms, and shoulders as broad as a truck. His fur was thick and golden, and his eyes glowed with a fierce intelligence. The dog snarled and lunged, but Chet was too quick for him. He dodged their attacks with ease, using his great strength to knock them back. The dogs soon realized that they had met their match, and they began to slink away into the shadows. But Chet wasn't finished with them yet. He chased after them, barking and growling in a way that nearly sounded like language. His voice was thunder. His eyes were filled with a righteous anger. The dogs whimpered and cowered, intimidated by the immense dogman's presence. They knew that they had messed with the wrong cryptid on that day. Finally, Chet returned to young Grandpa Tate, his head held high. He had saved his friend from certain death, and he was proud of what he had accomplished. Tate looked up at him with awe, realizing just how powerful and noble that dogman was. From that day on, Chet became a living legend in those woods. The wild dogs never returned, for they knew that Chet was watching over that forest, and whenever other creatures were hurt or in danger, Chet was always there to help. His strength and courage would never be forgotten, and those who witnessed his heroism knew that they were in the presence of greatness. After that, Grandfather Tate and Chet were even closer than before. They became inseparable, and they were always seen together. They would go on hunting trips and explore the countryside, and Chet would protect Grandfather Tate from harm. But let me tell you, folks, Chet's greatest act of heroism was one that no one ever saw coming. It was a beautiful summer day, and my Grandfather Tate and Chet were out in the woods for a leisurely walk. They had been hiking for about an hour when Chet suddenly took off running. Grandfather Tate called for him, but Chet ignored him and ran deep into the woods. Now Grandfather Tate was worried sick. He knew that Chet wouldn't just run off like that without a good reason. So he followed him deep into the woods, hoping to find him. Tate trailed Chet through the forest for about 20 minutes before he finally found him. He was at the edge of a lake, barking at a school bus that was half submerged in the water. Grandfather Tate couldn't believe his eyes. There were children inside that bus, and the water was quickly rising. Without a second thought, Chet dove into the water and started pulling the children out of the bus. Grandfather Tate rushed to help him, and together, they saved every single child. It turns out that the school bus had lost control on a winding road and tumbled down into the lake. Chet, with his incredible sense of hearing, had heard the children's cries for help and ran to their rescue. It was a true act of heroism. From that day on, Chet was not just a hero to my grandfather Tate, but to the entire village. His legend lived on, and people would tell stories about his bravery for generations to come. And now here I am, telling you all about Chet, a dogman, a hero, and a true friend. He may have left this world many years ago, but his memory will always be alive in our hearts. I remember the story of Chet the dogman having a battle with a big grizzly bear. Grandpa Tate was out on a camping trip deep in the heart of the mountains when he stumbled upon the massive beast. At first, he didn't think he'd make it out alive. The grizzly was huge, towering over him, with its teeth bared and claws extended. But Chet was fearless. He didn't back down in the face of danger. Instead, he stepped forward, barking and growling at the massive bear. The grizzly charged, but Chet didn't flinch. He met the bear head-on, snarling and snapping his powerful jaws. The two went at it, a furious battle between cryptid and beast. It seemed impossible, but like something out of a movie. Chet took down the grizzly. His skill and bravery saved Grandpa Tate's life that day. And if he hadn't, generations of my family would never have been born. There's another great story about Chet, the massive and silent dogman, saving one of the neighbor kids. It was a warm day, and the kids were running around and getting into mischief. Suddenly, Grandpa Tate heard cries for help coming from the edge of the woods. He got up from his porch and raced toward the sound. As he got closer, he could see that one of the neighbor's kids had somehow crawled up inside of an old dead log, and he couldn't get back out. The kid was crying and screaming for help. So, like Commissioner Gordon using the bat signal, Grandpa Tate called out for Chet. Soon enough, he came bounding out of the forest, his massive size and strength earning looks of respect and awe from all the kids around. With a swift and powerful motion, Chet cracked the log open like it was nothing. The kid came out squealing and wiping bugs and larvae off himself for the rest of the day. Everybody was amazed and extremely grateful for Chet's bravery and strength. From that day on, the neighborhood kids would come and visit with Chet when he came out of the woods. Sometimes they'd sit with him for hours on end. They'd pet his fur and admire his massive size, while he watched over them with a sense of calm and ease. Chet may have been tough and silent, but he was also a gentle giant who had a heart of gold. Now, there was another family that moved in as Grandpa Tate got himself a job all the way over in Milwaukee and moved away from the area for a while. This new family did not like Chet at all, and the matriarch of that clan actually tried to have Chet put down by the authorities. I direct you to her, but she's long gone. I have been in touch with her granddaughter on Facebook, who is also now nearing 80 herself, which underscores how old these stories are. I don't know much about her opinions concerning Chet, as I'm only a casual online acquaintance of hers and we were never friends in real life. If she remembers any of the drama with her mother and Chet, that might make a good counterpoint for my stories praising the beast. Editor's note. I contacted the lady in question, who wishes to remain anonymous, but who gave me this official statement about her mother and Chet. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I do remember the animal that you are talking about. My mother told me she witnessed it with her own eyes on 3 occasions, And even though she only saw it walking or standing, these were still very memorable occasions for her, which she would talk about randomly. I am in possession of her diaries, and I'd like to give you an excerpt from one of the times she wrote about the creature in question in the past tense, about 19 years after it had passed on. And I quote, "The Dogman was intimidating, even from a distance. The families that had been there when we moved in, most of whom I remember as being very friendly and honest, but also drunken and dirty much of the time, were treating the Monster Man as though it were a family pet. They would go right up to it and roughhouse with it, supposedly, although I did not get to personally witness that myself. I remember one day being told by my excited sister that one of the dirt roads through the settlement was packed that afternoon with teenage boys, each taking their turn wrestling with Chet. I begged permission to go watch the fights, which enraged my mother. I didn't show interest in the Beastman again after that, since I loved my mother and I never meant to get her so upset at me. If you judge my grandmother as being harsh, diary, I hope you will remember the place and time we were in. Not everybody lived to be an adult back then, even among the rich, and we were not rich. Leading a strict lifestyle gave you a better chance for survival in that atmosphere, and mine was a family of survivors. I did, however, date one of those drunken and dirty teenage boys secretly for a while behind my mother's back, and that boy claimed he personally wrestled Chet on more than one occasion. He used to boast about it to me. Although I was fascinated by it, I would often make him stop talking about the fights he had, because it would get me upset. I didn't want him to get hurt. The idea of that frightened the younger version of me. But he told me that actually Chet the Dogman would pull his claws in and he would play fair. It was just fun to that big beast. He didn't care if he won or not. He just loved to roughhouse, and he loved getting attention from all those boys, too. The way he talked about him, Chet was just a big, excitable, fun-loving canine pet. But this pet stood up taller than any man who ever lived, and the idea of even touching him made me feel faint. Dan did admit that he once caught fleas off of the monster, so it turns out to be very true, diary, that if you lie down with dogs, you honestly do wake up with fleas. And that seems like as good a place as any to leave it. That is the story of a time when people were too busy not to believe in the Dogman, especially if that Dogman was named Chet. Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot with a hot new offer for you for summer. Snag these badass new Scary Stories NYC sandal slide things modeled here by your old pal Bigfoot, and take 25% of the price off by using the checkout code YTShopping25. It's a sweet deal for both of us because YouTube is covering that 25% discount. The link should be in the description, and if you're on YouTube and it's May or June of 2023, then you might see an image of it right under this video. It comes in 5 different colors, so use them to express yourselves. And now here's another Dogman story. We've got one more short little Dogman story for you here, and it's called I Got Mistaken for a Real Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am an American who has only just gotten back from the UK, where I was unexpectedly cast as a dogman in a horror film being shot mostly in and around Birmingham in England. The original performer quit at the last minute, and I was the only other person around who was the correct size for the costume to fit, so I wasn't cast for my acting talent, of which I have precious little, believe me. The Dogman suit looked pretty decent, I thought, at least from most angles, but we had a problem getting the head on, and then a bigger problem taking it off. It took 2 guys to pull the thing off of me, and the 3 of us needed to rest after the ordeal too. It was actually pretty scary being inside that costume a lot of the time, and I couldn't have done it if I had been claustrophobic. So there was this one shot where we were going to shoot on the same block our offices were located on. They put the costume on me in the office, which took a half hour or longer, depending on whether the outfit wanted to work that day or not. And then the director and cameraman took off in the helicopter they had rented. An assistant director was communicating with the chopper overhead, and he gave me my cue when to walk outside. The job was that I was supposed to walk down this street behind our offices, trying to look scary, and then when I reached the end of the block, turn around and walk back to the office looking equally as scary. This would give them some different overhead shots of the Dogman invading Birmingham for the spooky movie, right? But what actually happened that night was that I started walking down this street, and then some drunk guys who were out partying saw me and started shouting that, hey, there's a monster in that alley. People started looking out their windows and screaming at me, throwing things down at me. I tried to remove my mask, but of course it was stuck on my head. I was trapped in my costume, surrounded by a mob of people who were convinced that I was a real monster. I turned to run back to the office, but there were angry people down there coming my way. That's when I knew I had to get out of there fast. So I started to run, dodging the objects that were being hurled at me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I was looking for a way to escape. I made my way to the main street as soon as I could, thinking I'd be safe there. I was not. Even more people saw me, and it's a credit to the effects crew that these people were thinking that I was an actual dogman or wolfman. As I ran panicked down the street, I spotted a police station up ahead. I knew I had to get inside to escape the mob outside. I sprinted toward the building, my legs moving as fast as they could. I was doing a broken field run around people trying to tackle me, playing American football in England. But then I reached the front steps of the precinct headquarters and made it inside the police station. I was panting heavily as I explained what happened to the officers. They were looking at me and each other, chuckling, and then I realized they couldn't understand a word I was saying with that mask on. At least the cops were sober enough to realize I was a guy in a costume. They started talking about me like I couldn't hear them, speculating on whether this was something I did for sexual reasons or not. It was pretty humiliating, but it was still better than the mob outside. Eventually the film crew caught up with me and they pulled my head off right in the police station, which got a huge laugh and cheer from the officers on duty. You know, you haven't been made fun of until you've been made fun of by the Birmingham Police Department. So I couldn't make it to Daly's, but I've heard the helicopter footage is awesome. A crowd chasing a werewolf through the streets at night. They rewrote the script to make the footage work, because it had cost too much not to use it. Plus, you can tell even from up there how scared that old werewolf was. That didn't require acting talent, believe me. So, the title of the picture keeps changing, but I believe it's going direct to streaming in most countries. They said they were going to tell me when it comes out in America, but they said they were going to pay me before I left England, too. I'll keep my eyes peeled for it, and if and when it comes out stateside, I'll let you all know. That story is the closest thing to a cryptid encounter that ever happened to me, and I was the cryptid in the story. For 32 months, he's a top-tier member from January through December. More exciting than the thriller In Manila, please thank Tim Walker, aka Godzilla. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Godzilla Tim Walker, for making this episode possible. Tim is one of our most supportive channel members. He was even writing me last night or this morning from Ireland, giving me advice on YouTube issues I'm trying to work out. He's a guy with some insight about life, and he's a caring soul. But watch out, because he's also Godzilla. Mr. Walker gets all our perks, but he deserves more than that. Welcome to Scary Stories to Fall Asleep To, Told in the Rain. Today I'm literally reading these stories while it's raining outside. There's a dogman in those woods. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a scary dogman experience one time. It really wrecked my holiday, and the same for my friends. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in a cabin in the woods of western Pennsylvania. Just the few of us enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the sun went down on our first night, something started to move around outside that cabin. At first it was just a rustling in the bushes, or a twig snapping underfoot. But soon enough, we could see the outline of something moving in the shadows. It was large, and its movements were like nothing we had ever seen before. Now I feel I should point out that this trip started when the four of us were gathered at my apartment, watching old VHS videotapes, and talking about how we feel modern technology sucks. We said we should go for a weekend in the woods and leave our cell phones at home. In fact, we should leave everything from the 21st century at home. My friend I'll call Bart said his uncle had a cabin in the woods with no Wi-Fi, but it had an old TV and a VHS player. Bart's idea was that we'd have an 80s or 90s weekend, pick a year, and only bring tapes from before that cutoff date. It seemed like a great idea to us at the time, but once we were out in the middle of nowhere and realized we had no cell phones, no GPS, no Wi-Fi, etc., then that idea stopped seeming so great. As the night wore on and we were watching old scary VHS movies, things started to get bad. We could hear howling in the distance. And soon enough, we saw something emerging from the darkness. It was a dog, but not any kind of dog we had ever seen before. Its eyes were glowing in the moonlight, and its fur looked like it was matted with dirt and possibly blood. We tried to scare it away by making noises, but it wouldn't leave. We locked the doors and the windows, but we could hear it scratching at the wood outside in places where we couldn't see it, and we were wondering if it was trying to break in. As the night passed, more dog-like creatures, all standing on their hind legs and walking around, appeared. When you saw one of them in silhouette, it really looked like that Egyptian god Anubis walking through the woods. It was pretty chilling. The upright dogs circled the cabin, their howls filling the air with dread. We were trapped, isolated, and alone, in the middle of the woods, with no one to help us. But this was our own decision. This was the result of our own choice. It was a scary night, but eventually the sun came up, and we woke up that next morning to find canine tracks outside the cabin. They were huge, with claw marks that seemed to be deeper than any dog's paws could have possibly made. Much of the morning and afternoon were spent discussing the possibility that maybe we should go home a day early. I, for one, couldn't enjoy any of the movies we were playing on that ancient VCR. I couldn't even pay attention to them, knowing that an entire clan of dogmen were all around outside. As the sun went down that night, we prepared ourselves for the worst. We sat in silence, listening to the howls and growls outside, knowing that it was only a matter of time before those dogs might try to break in. We grabbed whatever we could: knives, shovels, anything to protect ourselves. But I sensed deep down that it might not be enough. And then there was a shot outside, and the howls stopped. The scratching and gnawing ceased. We sat in silence, listening for more. But there was nothing. None of us ran any more movies that night. But nobody went to sleep either. We just sat there listening to nothing, wondering what those dogmen were going to do next, or who had fired that shot. It turned out that they probably all just left, but none of us got any sleep anyway. That was the worst night of my life, and I felt physically ill by the next morning when we left the cabin, shaken and terrified. That is one place I wouldn't go back to even if you paid me $10,000. How I became a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I never believed in curses until one was placed on me. I was just a normal woman going about my life. But then one night, everything changed. I was out walking alone in the woods when I was attacked by a pack of wolves. I didn't stand a chance against them. They clawed and bit at me, tearing my flesh and ripping the ass out of my clothes. And then, at the height of the attack, something strange happened. A dark figure appeared from the shadows, one with either a dog head or a dog head mask, and I saw it make a strange gesture at me with its wrist. Those were not ordinary wolves that had scratched and bitten me. Those bites gave me lycanthropy, and the gestures of this shamanic creature cursed me with werewolfism. Even in that moment, I understood all of this somehow. I collapsed in a faint onto the path in the woods. When I woke up, I don't know how much later, there was nobody else there, and I had no cuts on me at all from the scratches and bites I remembered receiving. At first I didn't think too much of it. I assumed it was just another fainting spell because of all the boosters I'd gotten. I figured all the stuff about werewolves was just a strange dream, a hallucination, brought on by the shock of the fainting spell. But then, on the next full moon, the change overtook me. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. My bones broke, my skin split, and I felt a pain like nothing I'd ever felt before. And then, before I knew it, I was no longer me. I was a beast, a wild animal, set loose upon the world. I could smell every scent, hear every sound, feel every vibration in the earth. I was stronger, faster, and more lethal than any creature I had ever encountered. But the real horror came when I reverted back to human form. As the months went by, I learned to control the transformation, to lock myself away and keep the monster from emerging. But I knew that it was only a matter of time before I would be exposed. The curse weighed heavily on my shoulders, a burden that I could never escape. And as I lay in bed at night, knowing that the next full moon was approaching, I could feel the fear building inside me, tearing away at my sanity. I was a prisoner, trapped in a body that was no longer my own, and the curse would never let me go. I've kept a diary of my mornings waking from my werewolf spells, and it's helped me remember more of the experience each time. I'd be glad to share it with you if you'd like to present it on your show, but it would be quite a bit of typing from my handwritten diary, so I'll only do it if you guys would really want to hear about what my life has become since this major change. But I understand if all that sounds too personal for the kind of show you do. Just let me know either way. The Bedroom Invaders. Dear Scary Stories NYC, do you do stories about monsters that come into your bedroom at night? Because I get these nauseating creatures. I guess they're aliens, but they seem almost paranormal somehow too. And each morning, the memory of the bedroom invaders stays with me for a long time, haunting me with their sickening appearance and their slimy touch. These things don't look like anything I've ever seen before. Their skin is a sickly green color most nights, but one time, around half of them seemed to have skin that was more of a burnt orange or a light brown hue. They seemed to be covered in a layer of mucus, giving them a slick and slimy texture. Their eyes are huge and black, dominating their relatively small inhuman heads. And their limbs are long and thin, with fingers that seem to stretch out further than should be natural. But it was their touch that was truly sickening. It's like having a cold, slimy, dead fish laid against your skin. The sensation is revolting, and it makes goosebumps rise all over my body. Every time they touched me, I felt like I was gonna vomit. And even thinking about it makes me queasy. I could never get a good look at their clothing or uniforms, as their appearance was so unsettling that it was difficult for me to focus on anything else. But I do remember that they had some sort of tool or device that they used to probe and examine me. It was cold and hard, and I could feel it digging into my flesh. To this day, I wonder what they did to me that night, and what their intentions were. Were they just curious beings investigating the humans of this world? Or were they something more sinister, with the intention of doing harm? The first time the bedroom invaders came from me, I woke up to the feeling of someone standing over my bed. My eyes snapped open, but before I could even take a breath, something grabbed me. I struggled, kicking and flailing, but it was like I was caught in a spider's web. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything, as the thing tugged me out of bed and through the air. My body was weightless as we flew through the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the cold air rushing past my face as we ascended higher and higher into the sky. Suddenly we stopped. I felt the ground beneath me, but it was cold and hard like metal. I looked around, trying to adjust to the pitch blackness around me, and then I saw them. I guess you'd call them aliens, with small lizard heads and wide bulbous eyes, on top of tall, roughly humanoid forms, staring at me from every angle. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their voices high-pitched and grating. There was none of the telepathic communication you hear about with gray alien abductions, so I don't know for sure that these were aliens at all. I was terrified, alone, and helpless. They strapped me to a metal table, and I felt their slimy hands probe and prod me as they ran tests and experiments. Every touch sent waves of nausea through my body, and I was sure they were going to kill me. But then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. I was alone in the darkness, with bruises and cuts on my body that I wouldn't be able to explain to my family or friends. Realizing I was back in my bed, I tried to go back to sleep. I couldn't though, because I felt like if I went back to sleep, that those slimy things would come back for me, and I would be helpless to stop it. The feeling of dread and foreboding stayed with me for days, weeks, months, as I tried to shake off the memory of my abduction. But I knew that somewhere, out there in the darkness, they're still watching me, waiting for their next chance to take me away. And it's only a matter of time until I feel those cold, nasty hands gripping me in the night all over again. Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot with a hot new offer for you for summer. Snag these badass new Scary Stories NYC sandal slide things modeled here by your old pal Bigfoot, and take 25% of the price off by using the checkout code YTShopping25. It's a sweet deal for both of us because YouTube is covering that 25% discount. The link should be in the description, and if you're on YouTube and it's May or June of 2023, then you might see an image of it right under this video. It comes in 5 different colors, so use them to express yourselves. Grandma's house. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a paranormal experience I can't explain if you want to hear it. It happened when I tried to make friends with my grandmother who I'd never met before. I grew up on the West Coast, while Grandma lived up in Maine. When my job moved me to Massachusetts, I decided to make the drive all the way up to Maine to meet the grand old lady, who I knew was getting up in years. It was supposed to be a quick visit, but it turned into a truly creepy experience that I will never forget. I could tell something was off as soon as I arrived. Grandma was polite, but distant. The house was old and creaky, and the air inside felt heavy and thick. My grandmother's eyes held a gleam of fear all the time, for no apparent reason. The way I got there was utterly bizarre as that house itself. I was driving on the highway, following the instructions Grandma had given me, which got me hopelessly lost. I was going down a lonely stretch of highway through the woods, hoping for a street sign that would at least tell me what road I was on, when suddenly a very large rabbit, the largest I'd ever seen, hopped out onto the road right in front of my car. I swerved to the right to avoid hitting him, and I crashed through the small barrier on the side of the road, rolling down an embankment into the woods. The angle suddenly got far steeper, and the car at some points was not in touch with anything at all, as we went into free fall for a second or two before landing hard and continuing to roll down that hill through the woods and around into the parking area behind a stately mansion estate. My front end slammed into a wall, and the car was finally stopped. I was pretty shook up, but I didn't seem to have gotten injured, so I went looking for someone who lived there to report the incident to and try to get a tow truck or something. I ran into a gardener who brought me inside, and after speaking to various people who worked there, I was introduced to the homeowner, who was, of course, my grandmother. I mean, of course it was. I was quite stunned as I explained the story to her, but she didn't find it as entertaining as I had. Grandma seemed quite distracted, looking around herself nervously, as though she could see things there that I couldn't. She had her chauffeur take care of getting my car fixed, and informed me solemnly that I would have to stay with her in the meantime. She said it that way, not that I was invited to stay or anything. I would have to. It was undesirable, but unavoidable. Grandma brought me to her guest room and told me I could stay there, but before I could even respond, she warned me against staying in that very same guest room, telling me strange things had happened there before. I had no idea how to respond to that, but I didn't want to be rude, so I just went inside the room that my very intense grandmother had warned me not to go into. As I got ready for bed that night, I tried to shake off the eerie feeling that seemed to linger in every corner of the room. I was just drifting off when I heard a noise, like something dragging across the floor. I rolled over and forced myself to go back to sleep, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again. This time I was wide awake and fully aware of the sound. Someone or something had to be in that room with me. I couldn't see anything, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but I could feel a presence, as if someone was watching me. Suddenly I saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I bolted upright just in time to see a ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a woman, translucent and shimmering, with long dark hair that seemed to flow around her like a river. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman didn't move, but I could feel her eyes on me. It was as if she was searching for something deep inside me, some hidden secret that I didn't even know existed. The longer she stood there, the more I felt like I was drowning in her gaze. Finally, she vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness with my racing heartbeat. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and I never returned to my grandmother's house again. I feel like I'm left over a barrel because I just can't rhyme anything with Nicholas Carroll. Please join me in thanking Nicholas Carroll, who's been a channel member 29 months now. Nicholas gets to see our weekly Secret Uncensored stories for a month. Scary stories on the road. Number 1. Werewolf transformation in my back seat. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I still remember that night vividly, even after all these years. It was a warm summer evening back in my college days, and my buddies and I were heading to a party out in the country. I was behind the wheel with cases of beer in the passenger seat, and 3 of my closest friends crammed into the back seat. In fact, they were the reason I was keeping the beer up front. We were blasting music and joking around, trying to shake off the stress of exams and the looming specter of adulthood. I was feeling invincible, driving my used sports car on the winding country roads, the wind blowing through our hair. Now there's a sensation I haven't felt since I went bald about 15 or 20 years ago, but this happened long before that. Then something strange started going on. One of my friends, Tony, started acting very odd. He was sweating profusely and his breathing was ragged. I thought he might be having a panic attack or something, but then I noticed something even stranger. His skin was starting to ripple and bulge, like something was moving underneath. And then I saw the hair sprouting from his shoulders, his face contorting in a sinister grimace. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. At first I wondered if I were hallucinating, or if I had hit my head on something, but everyone was seeing the same thing, so it had to be real. Then Tony let out a guttural howl, and I almost messed my pants right there. My other friends were screaming in terror in the back seat, trying to get away from Tony. They were convinced he was turning into a werewolf, and I couldn't blame them for it. I was starting to feel a creeping terror myself, wondering how the hell I was going to get us out of this situation. You know, Tony's real name wasn't Tony. That was just his nickname among us and a few other people. We called him that because his eyebrows met in the middle, and he had a deep voice like Tony the cartoon tiger on those commercials. Great! So because of that, we also called him the Tiger and Big Cat because he was so tall. I don't know what we were thinking though, because Tony turned out to be far more canine than feline. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I tried to come up with a plan. We were still a good 20 minutes from any kind of civilization, and it was getting darker by the second. Tony was flailing about and accidentally hit me in the back of the head, knocking me forward into the steering wheel and turning my lights out for maybe just a few seconds. When I came to, the car was spinning out of control, the tires screeching as we careened off the road and into a ditch. The impact was brutal and sent us all flying forward, slamming hard into the dashboard or the seat in front of us. I remember opening my eyes to a dizzying blur of shattered glass and twisted metal. We were all groaning, trying to get our bearings, and then I saw Tony climb up out of my sunroof, out of the car. At least I assume it was Tony. He was now fully transformed, towering much taller than his former height, with razor-sharp claws and teeth bared. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, and I realized we were now trapped in the woods with a werewolf. Panicking, we all managed to scramble out of the car and into the woods. Now, I don't know why we didn't choose to walk on the road, but we had just been conked on our noggins, so I don't suppose it's odd that we'd wander from the crash into a forest that we'd never been in before. I mean, even in a best-case scenario, the 3 of us were never thought of as geniuses by anyone. All I remember is that we were groggy, frightened, and confused. Not long after our stupid decision to do what we were doing, we could hear that Tony was hot on our heels, snarling and snapping at us as we darted crazily and haphazardly through the underbrush. I still remember the feeling of sticks and rocks jabbing into my one bare foot, as I lost one of my shoes in the accident somehow. That was also the first time I remember running so hard that my chest and my side ached. After what felt like hours, we reached a small rural road that wound through the forest, which actually had some old but still functioning street lamps on it. We didn't have a clue where we were, but those lights felt like home. So this time we chose to run alongside the relatively well-lit road, where we hoped Tony would be too shy to put in an appearance. The four of us staggered along the roadside, bloodied and bruised, hoping against hope that we would locate a gas station or a farmhouse or anything that could save us. But those woods were silent, and that road was empty, and we realized we were truly alone. It was a haunting feeling, being so isolated and vulnerable, with no way to call for help. Obviously, this was years before cell phones. We heard the howl, drifting through the night on the wind. It was a sound that chilled my blood, knowing that my former friend Tony was now out there hunting us, lurking somewhere in the darkness. It felt like we walked for hours before we finally spotted the red neon light of a tiny all-night gas station in the distance. That was the era before gas stations were all supermarkets. This was just gas in a garage for emergency repairs. We ran inside, gasping for air, and the attendant there called the police for us, translating our story to the cops. Then he set out with us to go look for our car, since we had all forgotten the name of the road we crashed it on. So while we were doing that, the cops were laying plans for a major search for Tony, starting at the crack of dawn. The search expanded for 3 days, but there was no trace of him. And Tony was never found. At least not that I ever heard, anyway. His family swooped in quickly, excluding the three of us from the need-to-know list, and so that's about all I can say about that. I never knew what became of my friend, but I knew he was out there somewhere, haunted by the curse that had turned him into a monster. I hope that somewhere, somehow, Tony's still out there someplace, and I hope that he is still thriving. Number 2, Spectre in Waynesboro. Dear Scary Stories NYC. It was a stormy night on Old Forge Road in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, and I was the only car in sight. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see the painted stripes on the black pavement ahead of me. I was driving carefully, trying to make it home safely. I felt a chill pass through my body. I looked to my right, and I saw a woman sitting in my passenger's seat. She was drenched, and her white dress was stained with mud, as if she had been out walking that night, and I'd picked her up as a hitchhiker. My heart flipped, and my brain spun in my skull, as I wondered if I had picked her up and somehow forgotten about it. But I couldn't have. I was still on course toward my destination, so how had she gotten into that seat? As beautiful and petite as she was, I was still more afraid of her than any fighter I ever faced when I used to be a boxer. All they could do was punch me in the face. But a girl who could materialize out of thin air? I had no idea what she could do to me. Meanwhile, she wasn't doing anything. She was just staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the road in front of us. I was terrified. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was I hallucinating? Was I dreaming? I wanted to shake her, to make her go away, but I was too afraid of what might happen to me if I even touched her. She looked like something from one of those Eastern horror films that my son watches, and all of a sudden I regretted not having watched any of those. I wondered if there were a way to dispel her, and then that word stuck in my head, like it was part of a George Carlin routine. Dispel. Spell. To undo a spell. She had cast a spell over me, making me terrified, and I was under her spell. She was controlling the mood, so I needed to change the mood. I turned the radio on. I thought maybe some music would ease the tension. It came on in the middle of that song, I'm on Top of the World by the Carpenters, and I tapped my foot and tried to sing along. You can't be scared if you're singing a happy tune. But the music was interrupted by static, and I couldn't tune in any other stations for some weird reason. The only thing I could hear was the sound of the rain hitting the windshield, and I began to feel even more frightened than before. The woman was still by my side, looking straight ahead. Her face was expressionless, and it was as if she weren't even present. I tried to speak to her like, "Hey, lady, and anybody home over there?" But she didn't respond. She just sat there, as if she was waiting for, I don't know, something. I continued driving, scared out of my mind. I didn't want to look at her, but I couldn't help it. Something about her was so intriguing, even though I knew it wasn't right. Her hair was a mess. Her skin was so pale. Suddenly, and this happened really fast as I was looking, she sort of folded up, like paper, and was sucked out of the car window, up and behind us, by a gust of wind or something. Now this happened in much less time than it took for me to describe it, believe me. I lost control of the car momentarily in shock, and I inhaled so hard that I choked myself. So I was careening left and right on the road, coughing violently, and I tried to hit the brake, but somehow hit the gas, prolonging my torment and almost getting myself killed. The car finally came to a halt diagonally across the road. I caught my breath and drove off to the side to give my heart a chance to reboot itself. I just sat there, panting and wheezing, trying to make sense out of what just happened. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what to do. So I just drove home, still shaking. I tried to forget about the woman in my passenger seat, but I couldn't. It was a ghostly encounter that I will never forget. To number 3, Shirtless Man versus Sasquatch in Alaska. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I know that what I'm about to tell you might sound completely ludicrous, but believe me when I say that it really happened. It was around midnight, and I was driving down the Dalton Highway through Alaska, really just a thin strip of blacktop stretching through the wilderness, with no other road for many miles. I was on my way to my uncle's cabin when I saw something that would change my life forever. As I was driving down a desolate road, I caught sight of a huge, shirtless Native American man standing in the middle of the street. He had bulging muscles and a stern expression on his face. As I got closer, I could see that he was preparing for something. His fists were clenched and raised, ready to fight something I couldn't see in the tree line. I drove a little closer and saw something that left me speechless. In front of the man stood a creature that I could only describe as a Sasquatch. The animal was at least 2 heads taller than the Native American man, with stringy hair all over his body and piercing red eyes. His arms were twice the size of my car, and his King Kong-like hands were raised in a menacing stance. The two began exchanging punches immediately, each one sending the other staggering backward. Their fight filled the road, and I had no choice but to stop and watch. The force of each blow echoed through the otherwise silent night, shattering the peacefulness of the forest around us. Each opponent only occasionally made a sound as though they had experienced pain, even though some of those blows might have cracked the skull of an ordinary man. Whoever that human was out there, he was clearly not an ordinary member of our species. The fight seemed to go on forever, each opponent taking turns at being on the receiving end of a devastating blow. The Sasquatch was clearly stronger, sometimes knocking the human on his backside, but the Native American man was quicker and more agile, avoiding some blows and landing 2 or 3 to every one from his larger opponent. They seemed evenly matched, and neither one was willing to back down anytime soon. Eventually, after an intense struggle, the Squatch picked up a large boulder and bent down to literally crush his enemy. But that man managed to land a powerful punch to the Sasquatch's stomach, sending the beast and his boulder flying backward off the road. The man ran into the woods to take advantage of the situation, and I gunned it out of there, while the road was unoccupied by characters escaped from some Bigfoot fantasy novel or something. And that's the last I ever saw of them, I'm quite glad to say. Of course, when I reached my destination and told my uncle this story, he was like, "Oh yeah, that's Sam. He and that Bigfoot really don't get along." I just looked at my uncle, waiting for him to crack a smile, or somehow tell me he was joking, but instead, he just asked me which of the two wine choices he had available I would prefer with dinner. I still don't know if he was serious or not, but that's what my uncle was like. However, that's also kind of how I see Alaska in general. The strange can be normal there, kind of. And of all the strange things I experienced while I was there, I'd have to list this one as the strangest of all. Number 4. The Thing in the Pine Barrens. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I know what I saw that day in the Pine Barrens, and nobody can tell me otherwise. It was a bright, sunny day, and I was out for a walk, taking in the sights and the sounds of the forest. The air was crisp, and the leaves rustled under my feet as I made my way deeper into the woods. As I walked, I caught sight of something moving in the distance. At first I thought it might be a rabbit, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small green creature, about 2 feet tall, with one single glowing yellow eye in the center of its face, and 2 green bullhorns up on top of its head. At times I thought it was humanoid in shape, with 2 legs and 2 arms, standing upright. But then other times I could swear it was fluttering those arms as though they were, well, wings? I realize I sound like I'm describing something from an old Fearsome Critters manual, but this was what I seemed to be seeing. I froze, unsure of what to do. Obviously I had never seen anything like this before, and I didn't know if it was dangerous. I watched as it walked around, pondering my next move. After some time, the creature turned around in my direction, and I got a much better look at its face. I saw something that looked like it was from another world. It really was a cyclops, and it looked as if it were supposed to be. Not like it was malformed or anything. I expect its mother thought it was handsome, or lovely, or whatever mothers of its species think of their offspring. I don't remember seeing a nose, and its mouth curved from one side of its face to the other, under that glowing yellow eyeball, to form a kind of a sad smile. I was terrified, but also fascinated. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The creature stared at me for a few moments, before turning and running off into the woods. It moved like lightning, faster than any creature I'd ever seen before. I stood there stunned, trying to process what I had just witnessed. But even now, years later, I can still picture the creature's face so vividly. I've been back to the Pine Barrens several times since then, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature, but it hasn't shown itself to me. Sometimes I wonder if it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know it was real. Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot with a hot new offer for you for summer. Snag these badass new Scary Stories NYC sandal slide things modeled here by your old pal Bigfoot, and take 25% of the price off by using the checkout code YTShopping25. It's a sweet deal for both of us because YouTube is covering that 25% discount. The link should be in the description, and if you're on YouTube and it's May or June of 2023, then you might see an image of it right under this video. It comes in 5 different colors, so use them to express yourselves. And now here's another Dogman story. Number 5. Chased from Lover's Lane. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I sit in my rocking chair, the cool breeze of the autumn evening blowing in through the open window. My mind drifts back to when I was 19 years old, full of life and reckless adventure. Back then, I used to take my girlfriend Mary out on long drives on the old logging roads just outside of Canby, Oregon. We were always looking for a quiet spot to steal a kiss or two. We found a secluded grove of trees on the edge of a clearing. It was the perfect spot for us to spend some time together, away from prying eyes. The weather was great, so rather than sit neck in the hot car, we parked it and walked hand in hand into the clearing. It was a moonlit evening, as the leaves rustled in the gentle breeze. We lay there for a while on the grass under a tree, talking about our futures, what we wanted to do with our lives, and how we would be together forever. But our romantic moment was cut abruptly short by a loud growling noise that echoed through the trees. At first we thought it was a bear or a cougar, but when we saw a hulking, hairy figure lumbering toward us, we knew we were in trouble. I thought it was a Sasquatch, one of the legendary creatures that roam the forests of the Pacific Northwest. But this one had a face more like a dog or a wolf. My girl was screaming about a werewolf, but I don't know if those exist outside of movies. The creature, whatever it was, let out a blood-curdling shriek, which sent shivers down my spine and made me scramble to get up to my feet. Mary was already up, pulling at my arm and urging me to run. We took off like a shot. We both knew that we would be in serious trouble if that creature caught up with us. We finally made it back to the car, panting and gasping for breath, but the creature didn't give up yet. It continued to chase us down the road for over half a mile until we finally reached the main street. As we sped away in the car, we both knew that we had narrowly escaped the clutches of a very angry Sasquatch-like dog or dogman. Now, as an old man sitting in my rocking chair, I think about that night, and I wonder if we really did dodge a bullet. But no matter what anyone else might say, I know what I saw and felt, and the memory of that chase with Mary will always be with me to my dying day. Without CS, there would be no show. We couldn't do it without her, you know. Her donations have always lightened the mood, because then I could finally afford food. Look, I don't want to say things have gotten tough for us on YouTube, but things have gotten tough for us on YouTube. When people like CS and all of you donate to us, it literally feeds me and the cats, or goes to other necessities. We also have clubs you can join and get secret episodes, which lately have been coming out Mondays for whatever reason.
Tonight, 4 different people all claiming I lived through the scariest dogman encounter ever. Only you can decide which is the scariest. All 4 stories read by PQ River. Story number 1. Dogmanus Interruptus. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I lived through the scariest dogman encounter ever, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. It was a chilly autumn night in the woods of northern Michigan, and I was driving down County Highway 557, which is an unlit 2-lane highway zipping through forests and fields around Cornell, Michigan. I was passing sort of by the Gwynn State Forest area on my way home from a long day of work, and I was tired. I'd been speeding along for hours, and I was eager to get home. As I drove deeper into the forest, I began to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods were dark and foreboding, and I couldn't see anything beyond the headlights of my car. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't get the notion out of my head. When I'm nervous, I feel like I have to pee. Same thing when I'm cold. This was a cold night where I was feeling nervous, so I decided I'd better find a spot somewhere on this dark road where I could hop into the woods and hydrate some of the vegetation. After what seemed an eternity of driving, I finally saw a spot where I could pull off the asphalt to relieve myself. I got out of the car and trotted quickly a short distance into the woods, hopping up and down to prevent anything happening too soon. As I was finally doing my business and feeling a most intense sense of relief, I heard a strange noise that erased all that. It was a low growling sound, and it seemed to be coming from behind me. The trouble was, that growling sound made me nervous, and the more nervous I got, the more I had to pee. The more I did my business, the more the growling behind me intensified, which in turn made me even more nervous. When I finally finished, I then had to repackage everything downstairs, and I kept praying that if I continued acting nonchalant, the growling animal would either go away or maybe fall asleep from boredom. I turned around and found that neither was the case. I looked and I saw the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It was a huge, 8-foot-tall, upright canine. Its eyes glowed golden yellow in the dark, and its teeth gleamed greenish off-white in the moonlight. It was like a werewolf from a movie, but a good movie, not something made in the last 10 years. The nasty-smelling beast-man growled again, and I knew I had to get back to my car as fast as possible. I ran deeper into the woods, trying to throw the dogman off my trail, then doubled back around to my car as fast as I could. Wherever I went, the dogman chased me. It was incredibly fast, and it seemed to be gaining on me with each step. I reached my car just in time, and I jumped in, slamming the door shut behind me. I turned the key in the ignition, and of course, it didn't start. I saw the dogman emerging from the woods, and I prayed before trying it a second time, promising I would go to church every Sunday for a month if it started. It started, and as I hit the gas to drive away from that lonely, smelly place, I was already starting to negotiate with God in my mind, like maybe could I break those 4 Sundays up over the course of a year or two? But the terror wasn't over yet. The dogman didn't give up that easily. It chased my car down the road for what seemed like well over a mile, increasing speed as I did, then keeping up with my car, even though I was driving at the speed limit. It only stopped when I finally reached a main road, and the dogman vanished into the woods. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't made it to my car in time. All I know is that I lived through the scariest dogman encounter ever, and I'll never forget it. Story number 2. The Dogman Church Fight. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I lived through the scariest dogman story ever. It happened a few years back when I was driving down Route 421 through Madison, Indiana, on my way back from visiting a friend out of town. It was getting late and the road was quiet with few cars around. As I drove near the Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge, I saw something that I will never forget. 2 massive creatures, each 7 feet tall or taller, were engaged in some kind of altercation in front of a white church by the road. They both looked like a cross between a dog and a man, and each of them had long, shaggy fur covering their bodies. It was as if I stumbled upon something from another world. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes and thought it was a prank or a special effect from a movie shoot. We're talking about 2 dog-headed werewolves, basically. I don't even know if a human could have recreated that scene, or 2 humans in costumes. I don't think the anatomy was human anatomy, and I was fascinated, but also more than a little scared. I just wanted to get past them somehow and move on. I tried to drive around them, but as I did, they both turned their animosity toward me and my car. I could sense their hostility, and it felt as if they wanted to tear me apart. One of them started running toward my car, and the other followed closely behind. In that moment, I felt a rush of adrenaline that surged through my veins. My only instinct was to floor the gas pedal and escape as fast as I could. The car roared as I peeled out and began to outrun them. I could hear their howls of rage. It was like being in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, trying not to glance in the rearview mirror and prolong the terror. I had never driven so fast in my life. And after what felt like an eternity, they began to look smaller in the rearview mirror, and I knew that I had outrun them for the time being. I stopped the car at the nearest gas station and tried to calm myself down. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I thought to myself, what on earth just happened? I will never forget that night. I don't know what those creatures were, but I know for sure they were not normal animals. They were something beyond comprehension, something that should have never existed. Whenever I drive down that road at night, I can't help but feel a shiver down my spine and remember that terrifying encounter. Story number 3. Dogman Turf War in Swamp Lake. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I lived through the scariest dogman encounter ever, even though it started out as the perfect getaway for this overworked professional. I have always been fascinated with nature, and camping in Swamp Lake State Natural Area in Wisconsin been on my bucket list for years. Finally, I decided to take the plunge and head out on a camping adventure in July of last year. I won't get into details, but I severely needed some time off just to myself and nobody else. Upon arriving, I was struck by the sheer beauty of the place. The lush greenery, the towering trees, and the serene lake all left me in awe. As I set up my tent, I couldn't help but notice the abundance of wildlife around me. From chipmunks scampering around to birds chirping in the trees, the entire area was buzzing with life. The trees were a mix of towering pines and smaller deciduous trees. There were ferns, wildflowers, and grasses of all sorts that seemed to emanate a sweet, earthy smell. The air was warm and thick, causing beads of sweat to form on my forehead. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sights, sounds, and smells shifted. The sky turned to shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sound of crickets chirping lingered in the air, punctuated by the occasional croak of a frog and the rustling of trees in the breeze. As the night wore on, the forest seemed to come alive. I heard the rustling of leaves and twigs, undoubtedly the sound of small animals foraging for food. Occasionally I'd hear the hoot of an owl or the howl of a distant coyote. These sounds were eerie, yet at the same time comforting, as they let me know I wasn't entirely alone. At one point I sat at the edge of the lake, staring out at the mirror-like surface. The only sounds were the water lapping at the shore and the occasional call of the loons. As much as I enjoyed the solitude and silence, I couldn't help but feel a little on edge, as if I was intruding on a world that wasn't meant for me. That night I awoke in my tent at a loud sound, but in my sleepy state I wasn't sure what I had heard. It sure sounded to me like a pack of dogs were fighting in my camp, just outside my tent. But what was the likelihood of something like that happening? When the sounds of fighting just kept going on, I decided I'd better unzip the tent, just enough so I could look out there. My heart was racing as I peeked out into the darkness, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't your grandpa's dogs fighting out there. They were half-human, half-canine creatures, and they were tearing at each other like they were fighting for survival. I couldn't quite make out the faces in the dark, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. I'd heard stories of werewolves or dogmen, but I never imagined I would see them in real life. Pulling my head back into the tent, I took a shot of whiskey I brung with me in case I see impossible things outside my tent. But even after I took a good belt, I could still hear those inconvenient dogmen outside continuing to be real. and in the same world that I was in. My mind raced with questions. Were they honestly out there? Were they dangerous? Should I call for help? I knew I shouldn't have come alone, but it was too late for regrets now. I unzipped the tent a bit to get a view of the battle. As the fighting continued, I noticed that one of them pushed the rest off and ran away into the dense woods. The others howled in frustration and anger as they watched it go. One of them, the biggest of the pack, let out a blood-curdling snarl before turning back to face the others. The 3 remaining wolfmen circled each other, growling and baring their teeth, sizing each other up, waiting for an opportunity to attack again. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to make a decision quickly. I quickly zipped up my tent, hoping they didn't hear me. I knew that I had to leave Swamp Lake State Natural Area as soon as possible. I began packing my things quietly and as quickly as I could. I didn't want to risk making any noise that would draw their attention. Suddenly I heard rustling outside my tent. My heart stopped as I imagined one of the wolfmen sniffing around for me. Peeking out just enough to see, I saw one of the wolfmen circling my tent as if it knew I was there. I froze, not knowing what to do. It was then that the wolfmen stopped circling and simply walked away into the woods. They seemed to have reacted to my presence by simply moving their business elsewhere. That was not what I was expecting, to be certain. I mean, they just acted like this was no longer a good place to have a turf war, like I'd ruined everything by camping on their personal battlefield. I waited a few more minutes, and they seemed to have actually left. Quickly, I grabbed my belongings and headed out of the park, looking back over my shoulder the entire way out of there. I know this is the scariest dogman encounter of all time, and I made it through alive with nobody's help but my own.
Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot with a hot new offer for you for summer. Snag these badass new Scary Stories NYC sandal slide things modeled here by your old pal Bigfoot, and take 25% of the price off by using the checkout code YTShopping25. It's a sweet deal for both of us because YouTube is covering that 25% discount. The link should be in the description, and if you're on YouTube and it's May or June of 2023, then you might see an image of it right under this video. It comes in 5 different colors, so use them to express yourselves. And now here's another Dogman story.
Story number 4. West Virginia Werewolf Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm going to tell you about the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and in fact, I'm sure it's the scariest dogman experience of all time. I was driving north on Route 11 in the middle of a dark night, having just left Virginia, and now finding myself following my grandmother's directions, driving on a 1-lane unlit road going through the woods of West Virginia. They don't call it Route 11 locally, though. There, it's called Big Oak Tree Road. That's because it's named after a big guy named Oakland Tree who built the first 1-lane road to hell in the USA. Do you believe me? You shouldn't. Now, obviously, it's called Big Oak Tree Road because it's lined with oak trees on both sides. I was just testing to see if you were still awake, because you're going to need to be paying attention to follow this one. This is something that happened to me back in the early 90s, and it's the scariest dogman encounter story you're ever going to hear. So this road was barely wide enough for me to fit on, and I was nervous about traffic coming up at me from ahead or traffic coming up faster than me from behind. I kept checking for space on the sides where I could pull off, especially if the road got even a little bendy. I was paranoid about getting into an accident, and then, all of a sudden, without any warning at all, as I was about to go up a slight incline, the car just clicked off and sputtered out. It made a sound like my grandmother, the cigar smoker, used to make when she first got up in the morning. This sort of wet, wheezing, coughing noise. And then that car engine went as still and quiet as a mob victim buried in a New Jersey swamp. I was more than a little surprised, and I didn't even know the car was sick, let alone ready to pass out. When I couldn't restart the engine, I got out to look under the hood. Of course, that was when a car came rolling along, only to find me blocking the road in front of him. At first he beeped. Then he got out and came over to see what the problem was. He spoke in a nervous manner, twitching like a meth head and twisting his legs as though he had to go to the bathroom or something. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him that my car stopped running in the middle of the road. That was not the answer he wanted to hear, and he informed me of this several times over, each time with the greater emphasis on the word not. He seemed to be trying to intimidate me, so I looked him directly in the eye, and I very quietly told him that I didn't care what he wanted to hear. I only cared about the truth. Now the guy flipped out into a rant about how he already knew everything I said before I said it. Then he stomped on the ground a few times and he asked me if I even knew what information was. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my car, and this guy was asking me to define the concept of information. When I didn't answer, he answered for me. If a sentence contains no new information, he insisted, then it has no novelty. And that was me, he said. I had no novelty because I spoke but I said nothing, just like all the politicians he voted against. Then he started ranting about politics. I still had no idea what was wrong with my car, but I noted that it had stopped smoking. That might be a good thing, indicating that it might have cooled down, or it might mean that the heap is deader than ever. The guy was still ranting about equations proving something about information or disproving it when I interrupted to ask him if he knew what was wrong with my car. That actually shut him up for a second, and he stared at me, wide-eyed, through completely dilated pupils. I asked the freak again if he knew anything about cars, reasoning that if he could get my car running, I could get out of his way. Well, at first I thought I had offended him, and that he was throwing some kind of tantrum, but then I realized it was more like the poor guy was having a fit, like a mental spaz out or something. I don't know what to call it. I'm not a hospital worker, but this guy was shaking all over. He was still screaming, only now, instead of screaming about semantics, he was screaming out in pain. And then the weirdo started cracking and bending in wrong directions. He looked like a human special effect, but I wasn't sure what movie I was watching a scene from. It felt like my eyes were being tickled from the inside when I would try to look directly at the guy, and I wasn't really sure what I was seeing happen in front of me. Then he started laughing, right? But this crazy kind of laughter, not anything healthy or normal. And this time when I looked at him, I seen that his ears have gone all pointed. He's a lot hairier than before. I asked him, "Mister, are you okay?" But obviously he wasn't, and I was so scared I felt nauseous. I went and sat in the car so I could watch him, but not get any of his bodily fluids on me, as he seemed to be having the strangest epileptic fit in history. And then, I swear, the next time I saw that nutcase, he had a long dog snout, and he was covered in silver fur all over. He looked like a human version of a wolf, but with much shaggier fur than a wolf is supposed to have. He howled like a werewolf in a movie and charged off into the woods, leaving me alone, sitting there in my dead car. I sat there, listening to the crickets for a while. Then I turned and looked back at the freakazoid's car. Its door was open, and the lights were on inside. It didn't seem like it would hurt anything if I just checked to see if Captain Canine left the keys in the ignition or not. Well, what do you know? The guy who couldn't think straight left the keys right where I needed them. I got into his crate, started it up, put her in reverse, and backed up to the closest area where I could make a U-turn. Then I drove down to someplace in Virginia. I think it was maybe Hancock or Berkeley Springs. I forget. But I found a phone and got a garage to tow my car in. Then I drove the Nutter's car over to the garage, and the rest is boring. But nothing leading up to that ending was, and that's because you just listened to the scariest Dogman story of all time.
Anna White is who we want to thank for sending us something to put in the bank. Please join me in thanking Anna White, who sent us a generous super thanks last night and thereby made this episode possible today. You too can send us a super thanks by clicking that thanks button under this or any of our YouTube videos. And in so doing, you buy us a meal, or maybe you buy my cat some cat food, or maybe I can buy a potato at Trader Joe's. Whatever it is, it's more than we've got right now, and we appreciate everyone who can help. So thanks, Anna White. Submission query. A Ranger's Encounters. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am writing you as an old woman who has spent 3 decades of her life married to a park ranger in Michigan. My husband, who passed away 5 years ago, had an uncanny ability to spot things that were never supposed to be there. He would come home from his shifts in the park and tell me stories that would make me shiver in fear. He would always say that he was not allowed to talk about these things, but he had to tell someone, and that person was always me. I have never shared these stories with anyone else, but I feel that it's my duty to let them be known. I have a collection of stories in my head that my husband left behind. Stories recounting his encounters with creatures that are not officially recognized by any authority. Some of these animals he described as having a surreal presence, while others were almost too human-like for comfort. Now, I believe these stories would fit perfectly in with the Scary Stories NYC format, and I'm eager to share them with your viewers. My husband's experiences while on the job have been officially classified as confidential, but I think he would have wanted them to be heard by more than just me. He would always say, "There are things that lurk in the forest that no one ever sees." I believe that these stories would be of great interest to your viewers, as they delve into the unexplained and the supernatural. As I said, I have an archive of these incidents locked away in my brain, but sooner or later I will pass on, and the stories will too. I am confident that these would be of great interest to your viewership. Thank you for considering my query. I look forward to hearing back from you soon. Sincerely, etc., etc. Story number 1. A Dogman Encounter in Michigan. One particular story that my husband shared with me involved the time he thought he was trailing a thief through the woods at night. He was working the late shift and noticed someone moving about suspiciously. My husband decided to investigate and followed the shadow for a while. As he got closer, he realized that the figure was too tall to be any human, yet it was walking on 2 legs. He thought that maybe he stumbled upon someone wearing stilts, but he dismissed that notion when the figure disappeared into the bushes right in front of his very eyes. While he was still puzzling over what he had just seen, my husband suddenly heard a growling sound from behind him. When he turned around, he saw an enormous, dog-headed, and hairy beast man on 2 legs. He had never seen anything like that before, but it matched the descriptions of the legendary Michigan Dogman. After that night, my husband became a changed person. He was no longer the same carefree ranger who laughed off strange occurrences in the park. To his credit, he never let his fear show to the public, but he knew that he had encountered something beyond normal explanation. He made a point to tell me about his encounters, so I would always be aware of the hidden dangers in the woods. I believe that his stories can help shed light on the things that go bump in the night. I am hoping that Scary Stories NYC will be interested in publishing some more of these tales so that others can know what my husband saw. Story number 2. Werewolf in the Woods. Another story my late husband told me was about his encounter with a werewolf in those woods in Michigan. It was a cold winter night, and my husband was patrolling the park when he heard a loud howling sound coming from the darkness. Curious, he ventured off the path and into the trees, where he saw a massive creature with fur as black as night and eyes that shone like gold. The beast was clearly injured. Its paw was bleeding, and it appeared to be in pain. As he approached the animal, my husband suddenly realized that it was transforming from a wolf into a man. The creature shrank down, its fur receding, and when the change was finished, it was now an elderly native man who groaned in agony. The transformation startled my husband. He didn't know what to do or say, but the injured man called out to him, weakly, asking for help. My husband quickly proceeded to offer medical assistance by dressing up his wound and offering a ride to the hospital, but the man declined, insisting that he wished to stay in the woods. Over the next few nights, my husband returned to the spot where the man had transformed, meeting the old native there and bringing him supplies. His wound healed faster than it would have on a much younger man, and the stranger admitted to my husband that there were some advantages to being able to change one's form. Apparently it speeds up the metabolism, both in terms of hair growth and in terms of healing. And so even at his advanced age, the native chose to live in caves and off the land as an animal. Those two could talk for hours about the woods, the creatures that lived there, and the mysteries that they held. Both had a deep respect for that park, and as a result, they shared many common interests. The native man was a loner and rarely spoke to anyone, but over time, he and my husband became friends. They shared stories, secrets, and adventures, and I assure you my husband enjoyed getting to know this enigmatic stranger. Over the course of their friendship, my husband had gotten to know the man behind the werewolf and had formed a deep bond with him. The wolfman had always been able to keep his animal tendencies under control around my man, but one day, that all changed. It was a sunny afternoon, and my husband was sitting on the porch of the ranger station, enjoying the warmth and the company of a friendly cat that liked to visit him from time to time. As the cat rubbed against his leg, he saw the stranger's transformation beginning. The man who he had come to know as his friend, the werewolf, was suddenly consumed by rage and transformed into his fearsome creature form right in front of my husband's eyes. It was like something out of a horror movie, with the man's bones cracking and rearranging as fur sprouted from his skin, elongated claws extending from his hands and feet. His face twisted into something inhuman and savage, teeth bared as he let out a deafening roar. My husband was frozen for a moment, the shock of the sight before him leaving him unable to move. The good news is that the cat, sensing the danger, fled immediately, but the bad news is that the werewolf then turned his attention to my husband. His friend was wholly unrecognizable at that moment, consumed by a primal urge to kill. The werewolf lunged forward, and although my husband tried to reason with him, it was no use. The creature was beyond all logic. Without hesitation, he leaped into action, using his quick reflexes to dodge the werewolf's initial attack. The werewolf was powerful and ferocious, but my husband's trained techniques allowed him to keep his wits about him, always staying one step ahead of the creature's wild, unpredictable moves. He was able to anticipate and counter every attack, using the werewolf's own strength against it and managing eventually to subdue it. The beast would lunge. My husband would move away, belting the beast man from behind as he lost balance and slammed hard into a wall. My husband cracked a wooden chair over the werewolf's skull and barely even dazed him. It was only after a few agonizing minutes of that werewolf attacking and causing chaos that he finally calmed down and transformed back to his human form. My husband was left stunned, trying to comprehend what he had just lived through. From that day on, things were never quite the same between the two of them. Though my husband never turned his back on his friend, there was always a sense of tension and unease hanging between them. The incident made him more wary of the man behind the monster, and my husband knew he could never fully trust him in the same way again. That transformation was one of the most shocking things my husband had ever seen, and it became a reminder of just how fragile the line between humanity and savagery can be. The orb. That was not an orb. I remember the first time my husband told me about his sighting of a bizarre light orb moving through the Michigan woods at night. He had been working the late shift as usual, patrolling the park and investigating any suspicious activities. It was a quiet night until he noticed what looked like a group of people shining flashlights in the woods. Assuming it was illegal farmers trying to tend their crops at night, he went in to investigate. As he drew closer, my husband realized that the lights weren't from flashlights at all. They were coming from a strange orb, hovering 2 feet above the ground. What was even more unsettling than that was that the orb was making the sounds of heavy footsteps and raspy breathing. My husband was afraid to move closer, but he was also equally afraid to turn and run away. He stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what he was seeing and hearing. The orb moved through the woods, bobbing and weaving like a drunk teenager trying to walk a straight line. And the strangest part of it all was that it seemed to be following him. As the orb closed in, my husband said he could feel a palpable fear washing over him. He assumed it was the farmers, and that they were probably armed and dangerous. But when the orb got within just a few feet, it made an abrupt turn and disappeared into the darkness. A few months after he saw that light orb, my husband was on his usual patrol when he saw it again. This time the orb was moving in an erratic pattern, zigzagging through the woods. As he approached it cautiously, the orb started to morph and take on a human-like form. To my husband's amazement, a huge, 15-foot-tall Bigfoot stood before him. The creature's stench was unbearable, and my husband described it as smelling like rotting meat. But what was stranger still was that the Bigfoot communicated with him telepathically, telling my husband a story about being a fallen angel from a formerly divine lineage. The Bigfoot explained in his mind that he and his people were once part of the angelic realm, but were cast out for not following divine will. My husband said that the Bigfoot's voice was as clear as if it were speaking out loud, and that he could feel the creature's emotions and his thoughts as it spoke. The Sasquatch went on to explain telepathically that it had been wandering the woods ever since it was cast out. It said that it was searching for a way to regain its former grace and become an angel once again. My husband was awestruck by the creature's story and could hardly believe what he was hearing. After this encounter, my husband's perspective on the supernatural changed. He no longer saw these beings as hoaxes or hallucinations or urban legends, but as living, sentient beings with their own histories and belief systems. In sharing his story with me, my husband hoped that he could make sense of and find meaning in these encounters. He never forgot what he experienced in the woods, and neither will I. The Hodag. My late husband always had a way of telling stories that would capture my attention and send shivers down my spine. One particular tale he told me that has always stuck with me was about the time he had encountered a Hodag deep in the woods. If you don't already know, a Hodag is a mythical creature that is supposed to exist in the town of Rhinelander, Wisconsin. According to legend, the hodag was discovered by a local logger named Eugene Shepard in the late 1800s. Shepard claimed that he had captured a fearsome creature with horns, a green reptilian body, and razor-sharp teeth that roamed the nearby forests. The story of the hodag quickly became a sensation, and Shepard began exhibiting the stuffed body of the beast at local fairs and festivals. Despite some doubters calling him a hoax, the hodag himself remained a source of pride and fascination for the people of Rhinelander. The town adopted the creature as its official mascot, and it has become an important part of local lore and culture. The hodag is celebrated every summer during a festival that includes live music, food vendors, and a parade featuring the hodag himself. But what my husband encountered was not some friendly mascot. He described the creature as being a giant, lumbering beast, similar in size to a buffalo, but with the ferocity of a lion. My husband had been out on patrol when he saw the creature feasting on berries from a bush, and he couldn't resist getting a closer look. As my ranger husband crept toward the monster, the hodag suddenly caught sight of him and let out a terrifying roar. My husband turned to run, but the animal was faster than he had anticipated and was hot on his heels. He knew that he had no chance of outrunning that giant four-legged creature, so he sought refuge in some tall grass behind a fallen log to the side of the path. The hodag charged right past him, snarling and snapping, searching for its prey. My husband lay there in the grass, frozen in terror, for what felt like an eternity, until he was certain that the hodag had finally moved on. He returned home that night, shaken but alive, having experienced a brush with one of the most feared creatures of the Midwestern wilderness. I could picture the hodag in my mind, with its giant, gnarled horns and vicious teeth, and I couldn't help but feel grateful that my husband had survived such a dangerous encounter. Although he's no longer with me, I find comfort in remembering the stories he told and the adventures he had, even if they were sometimes terrifying. It reminds me of the raw beauty and untamed wildness of the woods, and it makes me long for the days when he was still here to explore it with me. Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot with a hot new offer for you for summer. Snag these badass new Scary Stories NYC sandal slide things modeled here by your old pal Bigfoot, and take 25% of the price off by using the checkout code YTShopping25. It's a sweet deal for both of us because YouTube is covering that 25% discount. The link should be in the description, and if you're on YouTube and it's May or June of 2023, then you might see an image of it right under this video. It comes in 5 different colors, so use them to express yourselves. The Strange Light and Missing Time. One time my husband told me a truly strange tale, one that really gave me the shivers from head to toe. It seems he was out on patrol, and he heard some kind of a disturbance in the woods. He walked in there and found a young couple in a clearing having a big argument and shouting a lot. When he asked them what was the problem, they told him a very crazy story. The two of them had planned a romantic evening, setting up their tent in the woods and building themselves a campfire in a pit surrounded by rocks to keep the fire from spreading. The girl pointed out a bright light up in the sky to her boyfriend, which then seemed to become multiple bright lights. They thought it was a police helicopter when it shone a spotlight down onto them, lighting them up blindingly bright. They shouted up at what they thought was a copter until they began to feel themselves being lifted up off the ground and flying upward into the air. Soon they found themselves in an area that they called a hospital, but the doctors and nurses were not human, nor were they your typical gray alien either. They reported being poked and prodded by a bunch of green men who seemed like reptiles and human at the same time. There were security guards stationed at the 2 doors, and those guards looked like upright standing canine creatures. Bipedal dogmen, in other words. The two kept collapsing into arguments, and they were both embarrassed because they were wearing each other's clothing. Hers was torn being too small to fit on the young man, while his larger clothing hung loosely over his girlfriend's tiny frame. They both insisted they did not choose to be dressed like that. They claimed they woke up on the ground outside of their tent, wearing each other's clothing put on inside out. The campfire was already out and smoldering, so they must have been gone for some time before waking up. Neither of them appeared to be intoxicated, but both appeared to be in some kind of a state of shock. My husband helped them gather their things and walked them to where they had parked their vehicle. Both seemed well enough to drive themselves to the hospital, which is presumably where they went next. Well, that's a sampling of the kinds of stories he used to tell, and a couple of his buddies had some wild tales too. Of course, none of these went into the official record because these guys all wanted to keep their jobs. Let me know if you'd like to hear any more weird ones, and I'll see what I can remember. No matter where you go on the World Wide Web, you won't find anyone nicer than Deb. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Deborah Ariolo, for making this episode possible. Deborah is a member of our PayPal subscribers club, which means she gets to see 4 new secret uncensored stories each month, including the one we just put out yesterday, which has to do with a subject that I'm not allowed to talk about here. Smithson the Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you about a werewolf I used to know back in the 1990s, when I was in my 30s and living in Merrill, Wisconsin. I was walking down a path in the Kruger Pines State Natural Area on the west side of town when I saw my old friend Smithson walking toward me. He and I had attended college together back in Milwaukee, and it was quite a surprise to see him where I was. Although we had been inseparable in school, I hadn't seen him in years, so I immediately called out his name and hurried towards him to say hello. As we started chatting, we exchanged our current addresses and phone numbers so that we could get back in touch. After only a minute or two, though, Smithson suddenly began to convulse. I was shocked and horrified as I watched his body twist and twitch uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do, and my mind raced as I tried to figure out how I could help him. I asked him if he was okay, but of course he didn't respond. Instead, he simply continued to convulse and writhe, eventually falling to the ground. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out how to help. Should I call an ambulance? Should I try to give him first aid? I quickly realized that I had no idea how to help someone in the middle of this kind of a seizure. I had never been in a situation like that before, and I felt completely unprepared. In a panic, I looked around for help, but the street was deserted. The nearest hospital was miles away, and there was no one else around to help. I was alone, and I felt completely powerless. I tried to comfort Smithson as best I could, telling him that everything would be okay, and that I was there for him. But he was still convulsing, and I could see his eyes turning an amber kind of color. I felt sick as I saw his face reconstructing itself into something entirely inhuman. And it wasn't just the skeletal structure under the skin that was moving about either. I saw a nauseating dark leather blemish form on his upper lip. Then, as his face stretched out forward, the black leather fit over the end of Smithson's new elongated dog or wolf snout. He now had a black leathery dog nose at the end of rows of teeth fearsome enough to bite through your throat like it was a piece of birthday cake. This was no longer my college chum. In fact, he looked like he was going to turn me into chum. My heart was racing as I watched in horror, and the spasms continued. Smithson's body began to shift and contort, his limbs stretching out and reforming into long, slender legs. A thick coat of fur sprouted from his skin, and his fingers fused. to form pause. As if in a dream, I stumbled backward, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. Smithson was no longer human, but a large, furry dogman with gleaming eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. For a moment I couldn't move, frozen in fear and shock. But then the dogman leaped toward me, its jaws snapping shut. Instinct kicked in, and I turned and ran as fast as I could, the sound of its growls echoing in my ears. He chased and chased. As fast as I could run, it seemed slow to him. When I finally ran out of breath, I turned and looked, and I saw those eyes. Those amber-colored eyes. I couldn't look away, as Smithson's eyes seemed to pull me in deeper, almost as if they were vortexes leading to another world. The orange color of his eyes was so vibrant. It was as if they were alive and pulsing with energy. As I gazed into them, I thought I noticed something peculiar. It was almost as if there were tiny flames flickering inside of them, dancing and swaying to a rhythm that I couldn't hear. I felt as though I were peering into the past, present, and future simultaneously, all while being suspended in the abyss of his amber gaze. It was an otherworldly feeling that was both captivating and unnerving, like I was seeing something that I wasn't meant to see. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of secrets were hidden behind those piercing amber eyes, and what kind of power they held. There was something about the orange color of his eyes that made me feel as though I were staring into the heart of a great mystery. They were both beautiful and eerie at the same time, like the eyes of an angel and a demon combined into one. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply uncanny and otherworldly about Smithson's eyes. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, as if they were portals to an alternate reality, a world beyond our own. For a moment, I felt myself being transported to that world, as if the flames inside Smithson's eyes had engulfed me, and I was lost in a sea of orange. But just as quickly as it had come, the feeling disappeared, leaving me feeling strangely empty. As I pulled my gaze away from Smithson's strange eyes, I saw that my old friend was entirely gone, replaced by a beast, like something out of a Hollywood horror picture. The creature's eye level was the same as Smithson's had been, but then I realized it was crouching. Once it unbent its form, all the way to its standing height, I had to crane my neck back to see those orange eyes, now in the skull of a beast unlike anything my eyes had ever borne witness to before. The animal charged at me, all fury and fangs, and I thought my life was over. Both his paws landed hard on my chest, and I began flying backward, my feet up off the ground. I slammed hard on my back as I landed, and then that beast landed even harder on top of me, squeezing all the air out of my lungs, and as I later found out, cracking one of my ribs in the process. But he didn't stick around to eat my face off as I expected, so I was grateful. Instead, he just used me to break his fall, then ran off somewhere behind me. I was painfully gasping for air and feeling pretty bad for some time after that, so I couldn't focus on where Smithson ran off to in his werewolf form. When I got home, I called the number he had given me, and I left a message on his answering machine. Then I collapsed into bed, avoiding my wife's questions of why I looked like I had been in a fist fight. I didn't want to talk to anyone but Smithson about what had happened, and Smithson wasn't really in shape to have a conversation at that moment. And apparently he wasn't the next day either. I called his machine and left multiple messages, but he didn't call me back, so I was thinking that I should call the police and maybe tell them about what happened. I left him one more message saying I was going to do that, and he picked up the phone while I was talking. You could do that in those days before cell phones when we used answering machines. So Smithson started yelling at me that I was being a jerk and interfering with his personal lifestyle, or I don't know, something to that effect. I'm not remembering his exact wording, this is a long time ago. I reminded him that he had thrown me to the ground. He's lucky I didn't have whiplash or a concussion or something like that. And he calmed down a little bit. I'm not sure he remembered that part, to be honest. We agreed to meet for lunch to talk about it, and I knew a restaurant where we could get a booth in the back and not be overheard by others. Although he did show, Smithson was reticent about divulging too many details about his werewolfism. He kept trying to pull an attitude like I was being rude and I was prying. He kept asking me if I would ask so many questions if he changed his religion or changed his political party affiliation. I laughed at the idea of comparing being a werewolf to voting Democrat or Republican, but he kept doubling down and tripling down on what he called me judging him without walking a mile in his moccasins. I reminded him that werewolves don't use moccasins, and he got up and stormed out of the restaurant. I did try to call him after that, but eventually he either moved or got his phone number changed, and I figured that was the end of our relationship for good. Well, I sort of wish it had been. One night I woke up to hear a tapping on my bedroom window. It was persistent, and sometimes got sort of frantic. It was too annoying to sleep through, though, and I began to be concerned that a bird might be stuck or something. I got up and walked over to the window, which was on the 3rd story of an apartment building, and outside. I saw the glowing orange eyes of an upright canine, somehow balancing on a tiny ledge outside that window, far above the ground. I screamed and fell backward into some furniture, and the beast man outside my window simply jumped backward off the ledge. I got up and opened the window and screamed, sticking my head out in time to see the werewolf down 3 floors beneath me, running away on 2 legs into the woods behind our building. He wasn't injured. He wasn't even limping slightly. I didn't know for sure that it was Smithson, but I figured it had to be. He might not have been the only werewolf in Wisconsin, but he was the only one I was having an ongoing argument with. Not long after that, my wife and I were out celebrating our wedding anniversary at a club because she likes to dance. I admit that I had been drinking that night, so I'm not as sure of what I saw that time as I am with the other incidents. I think I saw Smithson. I saw him across the dance floor. I headed over toward him, leaving my wife behind me, because I wanted to have a conversation with that guy to get something straight between us. I am positive I saw him there. Well, pretty positive. But then again, I had been drinking, so maybe it was just someone who looked like him, but when I got to the area I thought I'd seen the man in, women were screaming, and men were trying to catch this very large bat. At least it looked like a bat to me, although it was as big as an eagle or a vulture. I just grabbed my wife and got out of that club before calling us a cab. There was no way I could explain to her what I'd seen. Either I was drunker than I thought, or there was a shape-shifting monster inside that club that was likely to come out front looking for me if I didn't get us away from there fast. Now, at this point, I started to read old books I found in our library about werewolves and other supposedly fictional monsters like vampires. Did you know that in some European traditions, the vampire can change form into animals and creatures? You see it sometimes in the movies when, like, Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee will become a bat and fly away. Well, another animal associated with vampires is the wolf. Dracula himself refers to wolves as the children of the night, and he calls their howling sweet music. And Dracula is also able to transform himself into a wolf at will, same way he can become a bat. Now, when I read that, it really blew my mind. So Smithson might be a werewolf as I'd been thinking all along, but then again, if that huge bat I saw in that dance club was real, and judging by the screaming women it was, could that have been Smithson? And could Smithson actually not be a werewolf, but a vampire who can turn into a werewolf? Now, to me, the idea that a vampire can also be a werewolf, as just sort of a subset of his powers, exploded my skull with ideas and possibilities. The more I read about dogmen and werewolves, the more I wondered how many of the Rougarou and werewolf stories might not be about sorcerers who transform themselves into werewolves, but actually about modern-day vampires who do the same thing. I was very excited about these ideas, but my wife absolutely forbids me to discuss any of this with her, so I was feeling pretty crazy, like I needed someone to bounce these ideas off of. No, I don't really want to become a person who believes in vampires, but I was literally faced with an angry werewolf already, so how much further of a jump was it really to begin to suspect that my former friend Smithson might be a vampire? Of course, the implication is that many werewolves in many sightings would then possibly be vampires as well, and that's the part that explodes a lot of the way I used to see the world. I had one more encounter with Smithson, and I hope for the love of God that it was the final one. We moved away from that place, and I'm not even going to hint about where we each moved now for obvious reasons. We had to uproot our entire lives. It feels like we practically live in a witness relocation program. But when I tell you about what happened, hopefully you'll understand our decision. One night we went to the movies, and as my wife and I left the theater, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The street was deserted, and the silence was deafening. I tried to shake off the weird sensation, but there was something in the air that raised the hairs on my arms. Just then I heard a familiar voice call out my name. It was Smithson, my former college buddy, turned enemy. I hadn't seen him for a while, and I was a bit relieved that he was at least in human form. But there he was, bold as brass, staring us down with a cold, dead look in his eyes. "Hello there, old friend," Smithson said, with a devious grin. "It's been too long." I wasn't sure what to say, but before I could even think of a response, something started to happen. Smithson began to shake and convulse right in front of us. His eyes turned yellowy amber orange. His skin stretched and contorted into an eerie shape. Before our very eyes, Smithson turned into a huge, hulking werewolf. My wife screamed, and I tried to shield her from the beast, but it was no use. Smithson had become something beyond anything I'd ever seen. The werewolf was huge, with teeth as long as my fingers, and claws as sharp as knives. It growled at us with a deep, menacing sound that shook me to my core. Smithson, or the werewolf that was once Smithson, started to step closer to us. My wife huddled under my arm, trembling in fear. I knew I had one chance to save us both. With a deep breath, I reached into my pocket, and I pulled out a silver crucifix, my last line of defense. I held it out in front of us, and the werewolf flinched. I wasn't sure if it was because silver was the only thing that can defeat a werewolf, or if it was because a crucifix is considered poison to a vampire. Then again, it might have been for some other unknown reason, but in any case, he didn't like it being shoved in his face. Without a second thought, I lunged forward with my crucifix, thrusting it toward the behemoth in front of us. The werewolf let out a howl, and then it was over. Smithson lay on the pavement, shaking and convulsing, but this time he was human again. I laughed triumphantly, but before I could even finish my chuckle, he was off the ground, and with his right hand tightly around my neck, which was quite painful. I didn't realize at first that his left hand was similarly placed around the neck of my wife. Then he lifted us both off the ground, and our legs swung as he strangled us with his vice-like hands. "Did you think I needed to be in wolf form to show you what I think of you?" he asked me. I couldn't say anything in return. I couldn't even breathe. He could have ended everything for us both. But as we were about to pass out, he dropped us, and we fell to our knees before him. Smithson gloated about how good humans looked when they're on their knees. It almost made us seem likable, he said. Almost, but not quite. Holding my head up by the chin to make certain I was conscious, Smithson told me that my wife and I had to move out of the state before 24 hours were up. We were never allowed to physically enter Wisconsin again. And then he detailed the terrible things he would do to my wife if I ever came back. My wife said that she couldn't leave because of her job, and Smithson told her that she was going to leave a message for her boss on his phone, telling him things I can't repeat here. Both of us were told to resign in an abrupt, rude, and unprofessional manner over the phone, and then be out of the state before we even made arrangements about where we would stay. And if either of us complained, Smithson said he would only make it worse and worse. Somehow we knew that we were going to do what he was telling us to. We'd be giving up both of our careers and all of our friends and family, and we'd be putting ourselves at financial risk while we drove around jobless and homeless until we were able to put down roots in some new place, which we never really did. Not together, anyway. The stress of all this was too much, and we both took up with different people in different locations. Smithson had broken us up completely. My wife was now scared to even be around me. Whenever we communicate, she asks me if any of my other former enemies have come out of the woodwork yet. And that is the part that really bugs me. Smithson was mad at me. He is probably still mad at me to this day. But all I actually did was leave messages on his answering machine, asking him if he was okay. I wasn't prying into his private life. I was inquiring about a man I thought was a friend, who I had just seen suffer a horrible attack. And for that, my wife and I were torn apart, and it took us both years of hardship to create new lives for ourselves. Doesn't seem fair. All I was doing was looking out for an old college buddy, and now I have none of my old friends anymore. I'm afraid to reach out to any of them. I don't want to draw Smithson's vengeful attention to them. And so I have to say, knowing a werewolf is not always all it's cracked up to be. Especially if the werewolf you know is Smithson. We got a nice donation from a nicer bloke. Means I can eat this weekend, and that's no joke. It's a PayPal donation from Godzilla Tim, so I can keep working, all thanks to him. Please join me in thanking Godzilla Tim Walker, who made a truly life-saving donation using our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page, the page where you can make instant donations to us that go directly toward food and necessities so that we can keep the episodes coming out. You can also donate through the thanks button under each of our videos, and we get that money when YouTube pays us once a month, which is awesome too. Whichever way you prefer is appreciated by us, and believe me, it goes right back into the show, or into my belly so I can keep doing the show. We also have cool clubs you can join, with secret uncensored Dogman stories that the public isn't allowed to see. The Deep Mystery of the Dogman by G. Mendelson. Edited and read by your old pal Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've been listening to your program for years, and although you are obviously not the most popular channel of your type, I do enjoy your approach and delivery. Attached is a project which I am hoping you would like to read as an audiobook on your program. This started as a writing assignment for a class back in high school, but I kept working on it after school, hoping to build it into a book-length manuscript, but never managing to get anywhere near that goal. I still think it's got good information in it that you won't find anywhere else, so I rewrote it as a sort of an article with a number of different creepy stories in it that witnesses told me off the record were true. So this is a Dogman-centric collection, but it's on the weird and supernatural side of things. And the one thing I think ties these all together is that little bit of mystery. What exactly is a Dogman at the end of the day? Or is that not the correct question to ask? For instance, how do we know that all the allegedly true experiences I'm about to share are about the Dogman, as in the upright walking canid type of Dogman? How many might be Native American shape-shifting shamans or skinwalkers, or French-Canadian Lugaroo, or Cajun Rougarou? There are a lot of different stories that have been going around in Europe, Canada, and the United States from a number of different cultures, all telling contradictory tales about what these upright walking creatures with dog or wolf-like heads truly are. On top of this, in more recent years, there has been a lot of chatter about the possibility that these could be creatures working for the government, perhaps specially bred to be used for security or warfare. Within these urban legends, you find sub-legends. Sub-legend A, the werewolves are actually being developed and bred by private companies. Sub-legend B, the werewolves don't actually exist but are holographic projections. Within sub-legend B, there are further subdivisions of people, some who think the creatures are implanted in people's minds through a combination of spectacle, suggestion, and psychoactive agents being introduced into the area via misting or crop dusting to make the human subjects more suggestible. Still others insist that the creatures are real and kept underground in military bases, only being released on the surface to serve as distractions to even bigger secrets that they, quote-unquote, don't want the public learning about. So there's lore within lore within lore, and branches of it stretching in directions so far distant from the others that very few can even agree on what the subject itself is that we're currently discussing. For me personally, I admit that the only thing I know for sure about the Dogman is that I am very confused about it. I have no idea what it really is, and I personally have still not encountered one. I have, however, spoken to some people who have, and I'm going to relate to you what each of them told me happened to them. I ask you to please accept what I tell you when I say that each of these people seemed sincere when relating their story, and they all seemed quite frightened at the notion of me identifying them by name in this article. The names I'll be using are all pseudonyms agreed upon by me and the witnesses themselves. When you hear how strange these stories can get, I think you'll understand why nobody wanted their names attached to them. I will be trying to name the town or area each event is supposed to have taken place in, and since I'm from Pittsburgh, you shouldn't be surprised that most of the events are weird Pennsylvania stories. All of my interviews were done old school style, with me meeting the person and bringing my tape recorder with me, the same way I had done it in high school back in the late 1990s when I started this project. After the interview, I would then go home and painstakingly and slowly transcribe the witnesses' statements from the audio, and that is what I'll be presenting for your interest tonight in these first two stories excerpted from my project. Story number 1. Bill S. tells us about the Dogman wearing gloves. I was driving toward the Burger Hut on the Colonel Drake Highway, which is Route 36 in Pennsylvania, around about Asheville, and my mouth was watering. Off in the distance, I could just see a big delivery truck bringing goodies to my favorite fast food stop in all of PA. It was kind of a dark and spooky day, overcast, with fast-moving clouds. I think it had already started to rain, but you could tell it was going to get much worse. Every so often I could see lightning in the distance, and then some thunder a few seconds later. So I guess it was a spooky atmosphere that this happened in. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about ghosts and goblins. I was thinking about good American beef, and how much of it I planned on putting in my good American belly. But then I saw that strange man off to the side of the road, and he was flagging me down, asking me for help. I instantly pulled off to the side of the road, and consciously I was thinking I wanted to do this because I wanted to get a load of this guy's crazy getup. He was dressed as some kind of a wolf man, like he was going to a Halloween party or something. The head looked really good, too. It wasn't some mask he bought at the dime store. He looked like a sort of a gray and white dog, I guess you would say. Except he stood like a man. He wasn't any kind of bodybuilder. Just an ordinary sized man. Probably not even 6 feet tall, to be honest. Oh, and sometimes when people tell me that I saw a real dogman, I have to break their heart by telling them that this guy did look like a dogman, but he was wearing gloves. Like maybe plastic or rubber gloves or something. You could partially see through them. What a doctor might use to operate so he doesn't get his germs inside you, or what a thief might use to break into your home so that he doesn't leave fingerprints behind. I didn't think this guy was a surgeon, so I was suspecting that he might be some weird kind of criminal. He spoke to me in a muffled manner, which I at first thought was because he was wearing that mask. I thought he sounded like a Native American at the time, but I don't remember why. He sounded older, like over 50 at least, maybe by a lot. I didn't see the mouth move, which made me more certain it was a mask. He kept saying the same thing over and over as he leaned into my car window, and I kept asking him to repeat himself because his voice sounded muffled. When I finally understood him, he was asking if he was on the correct wavelength, and I asked him, what's that supposed to mean? But when he told me that he needed my help in the woods, my mind returned to thoughts of Burger Hut and how delicious that burger was going to taste for the 1.7 seconds it'd be in my mouth before I swallowed it into my stomach. I once broke up with a girl because she didn't like Burger Hut burgers, and you would too if you'd ever taste these. So you can imagine my surprise when I found myself out of the car and walking through the woods behind this weird guy in the suit. From behind, the costume looked a lot more real than it had from the front. The legs moved and bent in a different way from a normal person's legs. They really did look like dog legs, and I began to wonder if this guy was deformed, or if he had practiced for years walking on his toes, like some kind of forest ballerina. The dog suit also had a tail that somehow knew to switch at flies buzzing around the butt of the costume. And why would flies buzz around a costume bottom anyway? Were even they fooled by how realistic this thing looked? We reached an outcropping of rock on top of a hill, which had unexpectedly strong winds blowing up there, and there was a man huddled down on the rock, seeming to be weeping. The Wolfman costume guy squatted down, and I saw this weird optical illusion where it looked like he had 3 feet to squat on, not 2. It had to be an optical illusion, though. I must have been seeing his tail, and it just looked like a foot. The costumed man held up 2 fingers to me, and I thought he was flashing me the peace sign, so I flashed one back and grinned like an idiot. I could hear the other man sobbing now, though, and I wiped the smirk off my face. Why had I followed this weird guy to this weird place? What was going to happen to me now? That was the question I was asking myself. What was going to happen to me? As though I had no power or say or control in this situation. And I suppose I didn't. The man took off one of his gloves. When the glove was on, he had ordinary human hands. But when he took it off, what I saw emerge from the semi-translucent plastic or rubber or whatever it was glove was a hairy, clawed, canine paw, not a human hand whatsoever. My heart began to race, and for the first time, I got scared. This seemed like something happening to the other guy, until I saw that monster, claw, hand, paw, at the end of this guy's hairy arm, and I realized that I wasn't in Kansas anymore. I mean, I had seen human hands under those gloves, and these paws were not even close to the same shape. Not only that, but those long, sharp claws would have easily torn through those thin, flimsy gloves. He definitely had human hands, and then he definitely didn't. I was sweating like it was 100 degrees, but it wasn't, and I was breathing really weird and hard. It was like every cell in my body was terrified and wanted to run out of there. But I just sat there obediently instead. The weird magic monster thing called out my friend Sam's name, and the crying man came over. The native voice told me this was my friend Sam, and I stared at him, not recognizing him at all. After a while, I got up and went over to the crying man, and then he did look like Sam. I thought Sam had passed away overseas years ago, but he looked quite healthy to me, if sad. He told me that he'd been to hell and back, and we gave each other a big bro hug. I wanted to ask him about the strange werewolf man, but he was no longer there when I looked back, and for some reason, it felt like a subject that neither of us wanted to talk about. I walked Sam back to my car and took him to Burger Hut, and then he moved in with me for a while. I got him a job, and we hung out a lot for a while. Then Sam stole my girlfriend, and I made him get his own place. Not sure what's up with him any longer, as I am married now, and I don't want Sam coming around to steal my wife. End of Bill S. story. Now, does that sound like he encountered an unknown cryptid? Nothing can ever be simple in Pennsylvania, man. That's the only constant about my home state. This next weird Pennsylvania Dogman story actually happened to a somewhat distant relative of mine, which makes keeping her anonymity a little more difficult. We didn't even know we were related until I was literally sitting in her living room talking to her. We have one living relative that we both know, and that's it. It's a relationship by marriage, not blood, but she's my cousin anyway, and we do keep in touch still after this, trading dogman and cryptid stories we see online with each other. This is obviously a mutual interest of ours. We're going to call my cousin Barbara, for personal reasons, and let's jump into it. Story number 2. Cousin Barbara tells us about the old lady and the bear-like dogman. We had a big dogman that lived here in the woods for the first 3 years I owned this house. I used to leave offerings for him and the old lady who looked after him. He was very old when I knew him. Those were the last 3 years of his life. People ask me if he was a scary dogman or a nice dogman, but they don't understand. This was not just a big pooch. This was some kind of a man. Just a man in a big, hairy animal body. He was a magic man, like a wizard or sorcerer. I don't know. Maybe he was even a shapeshifter, although I don't think so. He seemed sad on the day when I met him. Sad about his fate, in some inexplicable way. I felt like he wanted to be a man, or maybe he once was, but no longer. So if he was a werewolf, he was the kind that changes once, and then can never be human again. He seemed a tragic figure to me. He radiated sorrow, but I don't know why. So if you look out my back window in the kitchen, you'll see a dirt path that goes into those woods back there. That's the path I met the two of them on, and it was really something that upset my life for a number of years. It brought daily fear back into my day-to-day existence, which is what I had moved out of the city to get away from. And it was all because of what I still think was probably just a random encounter in the woods. I had been walking that path since I had moved in, only a little while earlier. It cheered me up after a hard day at my competitive job, but not on that evening. I was surprised to meet an old woman, dressed like a character from an old Universal monster picture, like a villager. She might have been Eastern European or possibly Romani, as she looked like a fortune teller from an old black and white movie. Walking next to her was what I at first took to be a bear, walking upright on its hind legs, as some of them are trained to do. Both of them were holding some kind of weird lanterns in their hands, I kid you not. I had never seen a bear except at a zoo, and I thought it was neat that the lady had taught him to pick things up, using his paws as hands. I have since learned that bears do not have thumbs, but I didn't remember that, in the presence of these two. Now, seeing a bear in the woods behind my house is not something I ever thought I would experience, let alone a trained circus bear. But there it was, and it was huge. I had no idea they could get that much bigger than a man, and I was so stunned that I just stared at that bear's face in awe. Once I locked onto his eyes, though, my entire world shifted and changed in a way that I still don't understand to this day. The old woman was talking English with a thick accent, sounding kind of like that woman that Trump is married to, if you've ever heard her speak. This lady was a lot older, though, and her voice sounded like she'd been smoking tobacco and screaming a lot for 6 or 7 decades. So maybe she had. I was holding onto a tree now because I was feeling dizzy, and like the world was turning to jello all around me. The only solid thing was the face of that bear, so I couldn't look away from it. I feared that I might pass out or pass on if I didn't keep staring into those eyes. I was missing a lot of what the woman was jabbering on and on and on about, but I noticed that she kept calling the bear a pooch, or her good little doggy, and I began to realize that he was not, in fact, a bear at all. He was just an immense and burly kind of a canine. I wouldn't call him fat, but he was hugely muscular. His fur was quite thick-looking, and I do believe there might have been a layer of fat to tide him over through the cold Transylvanian winters. But this was Pennsylvania, not Transylvania. So I wanted to question what was happening. Instead, I heard a voice in my head telling me to be quiet and to listen to the old lady. I did, and she was telling me things that she and the huge intelligent wolfman needed. Supplies, and what frequency she needed them at. Some were weekly supplies, others were daily. Some were medical, some were food. I would buy them all for her and the huge dogman. Some weeks I would eat oatmeal 3 times a day so that I could afford her expenses in my budget. But I had no ability to question the old woman when she told me her needs. And then came the day when she met me with the sad news that her pooch had passed on. She told me that she'd be moving away, and she wouldn't need my help in keeping the old dog alive any longer. The old lady thanked me for the first time in 3 years, and she told me that if I went to bed that night, imagining the life I would most like to live, she'd see to it that I was granted my wish as thanks for being kind to the old dogman. I tried not to chuckle at her offer of magically making my life perfect, and I thanked the old woman, excited to be finally relieved of the intense financial burden she had placed me under for 37 or 38 months. I tried to keep a sad face on because of the woman's loss, but I wanted to kick up my heels and dance an Irish jig on that day. I wanted to celebrate, but I finally realized I had alienated all my friends, not having the money to hang out in town with any of them for 3 years. I had no social life and no chance at any kind of a lover, since I never went out, and I spent all my money keeping a dogman alive in the woods. So I went to sleep that night, thinking about what kind of a life I actually would want to have if I had a choice in the matter. It did take a few years, but I mostly have my list fulfilled these days, including the return of my social life and a boyfriend who might move in here if I don't move back into town where he lives. Plus, I got to meet my wonderful cousin, who is the only reason I'm writing this all down in the first place. And that is my weird dogman experience. Thanks, cuz. So I'll cut it off there. And obviously, I have a number more to send you, as this is just the tip of the iceberg of those interviews, which were mostly done before 2016, although not entirely. I'd be happy to send more if you or your audience are interested. Our executive producer, S.A. Rose, is a PayPal member for years in a row. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, S.A. Rose, for making this episode possible. S.A. joined our PayPal club at peterbernard.com and gets to see our weekly secret uncensored Dogman stories. And so can you, if you listen to what this next guy has to say. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.